It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a quick break from the chaos of everyday life. Nothing fancy, just a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and silence. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, looking forward to a few days of peace and quiet, the kind of peace you can only find in the woods. I was already feeling a little on edge when I first pulled up to the cabin. The trees were thick here, far thicker than I had expected. The cabin itself was nestled deep in the woods, more isolated than I had imagined. I was used to solitude, but this was something else. The air felt heavy, as though the trees themselves were watching me. The cabin was small, with a weathered wooden exterior and a slanted roof that looked like it had seen 100 winters. I parked my car, grabbed my duffel bag, and made my way to the front door. The gravel crunched under my boots with each step. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and I winced at the sound. Inside, the place was simple, just the basics. A small kitchen, a worn-out couch, a wood stove, and a fireplace that had clearly seen better days. A couple of chairs sat around a small wooden table, and a bookshelf was stocked with old novels. It felt like the kind of place you would retreat to if you needed to get away from everything. It had a charm to it, but it also felt off. The first thing I did was unpack. I wanted to settle in before the sun went down. The place didn't have electricity, but there was a gas lamp in the corner of the room. The windows were small, covered in a thin layer of dust, and when I looked outside, all I could see was trees, endless trees. I could barely make out a dirt path leading deeper into the woods, but that was about it. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved around, setting up a few things. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation, but I figured it would be good for me. No distractions, no noise, no people. Just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. As the sun began to set, the chill in the air deepened. I could feel it creeping through the cracks in the walls, a coldness that wasn't quite natural. I stoked the fire in the wood stove to keep the place warm, and I settled into one of the chairs with a book. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and I tried to lose myself in the pages. But something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't like the usual unease you get when you're in an unfamiliar place. No, this felt different. It felt like someone or something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. I decided to go to bed early. Maybe some sleep would help clear my mind. The bed was small, covered with an old quilt that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The pillow was flat, but it didn't matter. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside. The trees were swaying violently in the gusts, their branches creaking and groaning. The cabin creaked along with them, the sound of wood bending under pressure. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, trying to drown out the noise. And then I heard something else, a faint sound. It was almost like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. The footsteps moved slowly, cautiously, as though someone was trying to avoid being heard. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the woods outside or if they were inside the cabin. I got up quietly, moving toward the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I pressed my face against it, trying to peer through the darkness. But all I could see was the outline of trees, thick and unyielding. There was no one outside. I opened the window just a crack, straining to listen. The wind howled again, louder this time, but the footsteps had stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from behind the cabin. I moved to the back door, gripping the doorknob, but I hesitated. What if someone was out there? What if there was something else? The scratching grew louder, more urgent. I opened the door just a little, my eyes scanning the yard. Nothing. The cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. I stepped outside cautiously, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. The trees loomed over me like silent giants, their twisted limbs reaching out, casting long shadows in the moonlight. I looked around the cabin, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no movement. The scratching had stopped, but the eerie feeling remained, thick and suffocating. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing, and my mind was spinning with questions. What had I heard? Was it just an animal, or was something else out there? I tried to settle down again, but sleep didn't come. The night stretched on, the wind rattling the windows and the trees swaying outside. Every creak, every groan of the cabin made me tense up, my eyes darting around the room. The feeling of being watched never left. It was as though the cabin itself was alive, and it knew I was there. The next day, I went out for a walk, trying to clear my head. I needed to get away from the cabin, away from the feeling that I was being followed. The woods were silent, save for the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I kept my eyes on the ground, focusing on the trail ahead of me, trying to ignore the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my vision. After a while, I found myself at a small clearing, a pond nestled among the trees. It was quiet here, almost peaceful, but the sense of unease never fully left. I walked around the edge of the pond, my footsteps leaving impressions in the soft mud. That's when I saw it, a trail of footprints. The tracks were fresh, the mud still damp from the night before. They led off the path and into the woods, disappearing into the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were too deliberate, too human. I felt my heart rate pick up. Someone had been out here, and they had been following me. I turned back toward the cabin, my mind racing. My instincts told me to leave, to pack up and drive home, far away from this place. But something kept me there. Something deep inside told me I needed to stay, to face whatever it was that had been following me. That night, I sat by the fire, my mind in overdrive. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, about the footsteps I had heard the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were hiding something. I decided to leave in the morning. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the cold was sharp in the air. As I loaded the last of my things into the car, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but I was leaving. Just as I was about to start the engine, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. This time, they were closer. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the dark expanse of trees. I didn't wait to see if they would get closer. I slammed the car into drive and sped down the dirt road, the gravel flying behind me. As I left the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I knew I had made the right decision. I had made it out, and as I pulled away from that cabin, I swore I wouldn't come back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. That was all I wanted. I had been working nonstop for the last 6 months, barely taking a single day off. Every morning blended into the next, just a repeat of emails, calls, deadlines, and late nights. My eyes burned from staring at screens too long. My back hurt from sitting too much, and my head felt like it was constantly buzzing. I couldn't even sleep properly anymore. I would lie awake for hours, listening to cars outside or checking the clock every few minutes. So when I finally got a long weekend off, I told myself I was going to spend it somewhere quiet. No emails, no phones, no people. Just silence. I didn't want to go to a hotel or a resort because that would just be another crowd, another kind of noise. I needed to be away from everything. I found a cabin listing online that looked perfect. It was a small wooden place about 25 miles from the nearest town, tucked into a wooded area near a small lake. There weren't any nearby cabins or houses. The owner's listing said it had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and only solar power. A gas stove, a wood-burning heater, and a single bed. That was all I needed. I booked it instantly for Friday through Monday. I left early Friday morning, packed with a cooler of food, some basic supplies, a few books, and a journal. I made sure my car was filled with gas and double-checked the route. The drive took about 3.5 hours. Most of it was highway, but the last part was a narrow, winding road through thick forest. The GPS stopped working once I passed a certain point, but I had printed directions. I arrived around 3 p.m. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Weathered wood, a slanted tin roof, a small porch, and a single door with a padlock. I unlocked it with the code the owner gave me. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old stone. It was just one room, not counting the tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a small shower that relied on a water tank outside. There was a metal frame bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and a wooden counter with some basic cookware. I opened the windows to let the air circulate and then unpacked my stuff. I put the cooler in the corner, checked the solar power system to make sure the battery was charged, and lit a few candles. There were no noises except for birds and the wind moving through the trees. It was exactly what I needed. That first evening was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, read for a while, then sat outside on the small porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The sky turned orange, then deep purple, and finally black. I could hear frogs down near the lake and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. I went to bed early. The mattress was stiff, but I didn't mind. It felt good to lie in complete silence. I closed my eyes and listened to my own breathing. For the first time in a while, I felt calm. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up once around 3 a.m. because I thought I heard a creak outside, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. I checked through the small window, didn't see anything, and went back to sleep. Saturday morning, I made some coffee with a little propane stove and sat outside to drink it. The woods were full of sound, birds, insects, wind, but not a single human noise. I spent most of the day reading, taking short walks near the lake, and writing in my journal. I didn't bring any electronics besides a flashlight and a battery pack for emergencies. I didn't want screens or messages to ruin the silence. That night, I fell asleep easily again. But I woke up around 1 a.m. to a sound that was definitely not the wind or an animal. It was a soft thud, like something hitting wood. I froze and listened. Another thud. I sat up in bed and held my breath. Came again. It sounded like it was coming from outside, maybe the porch. It wasn't loud, and it didn't happen regularly. Just once every few seconds, like someone or something was shifting weight or moving slowly. Then silence. I waited. 10 minutes passed. No sound. I slowly got up and walked to the window. I didn't turn on a light. The moonlight was just enough to see the trees and the outline of the porch. Nothing moved. I stood there for maybe 5 more minutes before going back to bed. But I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking about that sound. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a bear had wandered close. Maybe a branch fell and rolled off the roof. It wasn't that strange, but something about it didn't feel right. It had been too slow, too spaced apart. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I looked for tracks or signs that something had been on the porch, but the ground was mostly dry dirt and pine needles. Nothing stood out. Still, I felt uneasy. I kept telling myself to calm down, that I was just not used to being completely alone. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I didn't hike as far or as long. I kept checking over my shoulder and listening. Every sound made me tense up. That night, I locked the door and windows carefully. I pushed the small table in front of the door, just in case. I lay in bed with the flashlight next to me. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up again around the same time, 1:30 or 2 a.m. This time, the sound was different. It was a soft scraping, like something brushing against the outside wall. Then a quiet knock. Not a knock like a fist, more like a tap, like testing. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I aimed it at the window but didn't turn it on yet. I waited. Another tap, then silence. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, keeping my back against the wall. I peeked out. I saw something move, just a shadow. It was quick. Could have been an animal again, but it looked upright. I stayed frozen for a long time. My heartbeat was fast and loud in my ears. Then I saw it again. Movement just beyond the trees. This time I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and lit up part of the porch and the edge of the woods. Nothing. I kept the light on for a while. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I would leave a day early. I didn't feel safe. Something was wrong. Maybe someone else was out here. Maybe someone knew I was alone. I packed up slowly, trying to keep calm. I didn't see anything unusual outside in the daylight, but I kept checking the tree line. Before I left, I went around the back of the cabin one more time. That's when I saw something that made my chest tighten. On the back wall, near the corner, there were scratch marks, faint but real, vertical lines about the length of my hand. Not made by an animal. They were too even, too deliberate. And under one of the cabin's small windows, there were footprints. Human footprints. There. I didn't stay to look any longer. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could back toward the main road. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I felt like I was being watched the whole way out. Once I got back into town, I stopped at a gas station. My hands were still shaking. I wanted to tell someone, but what would I even say? There was no crime, no proof, just noises in the night and footprints. I drove home and didn't sleep that night either, or the next. A few days later, I emailed the cabin owner. I asked if anyone had access to the property during my stay. Maintenance workers, friends, anything. He replied, "No, no one else has keys. No one should have been there." I never went back. I checked the listing a few weeks later. It had been removed. The sun had just begun to dip behind the mountain, casting long shadows across the dense forest. I was alone in the cabin, a small, weathered structure tucked deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of pine, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind was the only thing breaking the otherwise still atmosphere. This place was meant to be a retreat, a break from the chaos of daily life. But now, with the sun setting and the isolation sinking in, it felt more like a prison. I had arrived earlier that day, after a long drive through winding roads and dense woods. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a few mismatched pieces of furniture, and windows that looked out into the wilderness. I'd made a quick dinner, eaten, and cleaned up, and now I was sitting by the fire, the only source of light in the room as the evening drew in. The solitude was something I'd craved, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The cabin creaked every now and then, the wood settling as the temperature dropped. The wind picked up, howling through the trees outside, a constant reminder that the world beyond the cabin was wild and untamed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone here. At first, I brushed it off as the product of being in an unfamiliar place. But then I heard it, a thud. It was faint, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Came from outside, somewhere in the direction of the woods. I stood up, my muscles tense, trying to decide whether it was just an animal or something else. There was no other cabin for miles, no neighbors for miles. This place was isolated. I walked to the window, peering out into the darkening forest. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch falling, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. I couldn't ignore the fact that the noise had been too deliberate, not like the random creak of wood or the rustle of branches. It had been too purposeful, almost like someone knew something was out there. I stepped away from the window and walked toward the front door. It was locked, but I checked it again anyway, my hands trembling slightly as I turned the bolt. There was a flashlight by the door, and I grabbed it, flicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the area beyond. The wind was picking up, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was the kind of sensation you can't explain, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up for no reason at all. I decided to get some rest, hoping that sleep would help calm my mind. But even as I lay in bed, the feeling persisted. The wind howled outside, and every so often, I could hear what sounded like a faint scraping noise against the cabin's wooden walls. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the elements playing tricks on my mind. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread. Hours passed, and the sounds outside continued. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The fire had long since burned out, and now the only sounds were the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Then the door creaked. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I had locked it. There was no way it could have opened on its own. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the wind whipping outside, but it was the silence in the cabin that scared me the most now. The air felt thick, as though something was wrong, something I couldn't see but could sense. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I touched the handle. The door was slightly ajar. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I slowly pushed it open, the creaking sound louder than I expected. The cold air from outside rushed in, sending a chill down my spine. I pointed the flashlight into the darkness, my hands trembling. The beam of light flickered slightly as my grip tightened on it, scanning the porch and the yard. Nothing. But then I saw it. A figure, a person or something close to one, standing just beyond the light's reach. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the shadows playing with my mind. But no, there was definitely something or someone standing there. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was tall, too tall to be normal, with an unnaturally wide stance. The figure didn't move. I stood there, frozen, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, to lock it again and pretend nothing was happening. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, and the spot where it had been standing was empty. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it or if it was real. But I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to sleep tonight. It started with something simple. I just wanted a quiet weekend alone. Life had been heavy for a while. Work, noise, people constantly around me. My phone never stopped buzzing. I had no time to think or breathe. So when a buddy offered me his family's remote cabin for the weekend, I didn't even hesitate. I said yes right away. He told me it was in the mountains, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors for miles. Just trees, dirt, sky, and silence. It sounded perfect. I left on a Friday morning in early October. The air was cool, not cold, but the leaves were starting to turn. Bright red and orange leaves hung low over the winding mountain road as I drove my beat-up Jeep toward the cabin. I brought only what I needed: some canned food, a couple jugs of water, a camping stove just in case, a flashlight, batteries, a knife, a heavy jacket, and my sleeping bag. The cabin had no electricity or plumbing, but it had a wood stove and a rain barrel, and that was enough for a weekend. I arrived in the early afternoon. The dirt path that led to the cabin was so narrow and rocky that I had to stop and walk the last 100 yards. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. It was small, just a single room with a tiny loft above. The outside was weathered and gray, but the structure looked solid. There was a small outhouse maybe 50 feet behind it, and a stack of chopped wood near the porch. I stepped inside. Dust covered most things, and the air smelled faintly of old smoke and damp wood. A small metal stove stood in the corner, and next to it was a bundle of kindling and some firewood. A narrow wooden bed frame against the wall held an old mattress with a few wool blankets folded neatly on top. A small table and 2 chairs sat beneath the only window. There were some old pots and pans hanging from nails, and a rusty sink that drained into a pipe that led outside. Nothing fancy, but enough to get by. I dropped my gear near the door and started cleaning. I opened the window to let in some air, swept the floor, wiped down the table, and started a fire to warm the place. By sunset, the cabin felt almost cozy. I heated some canned soup, sat by the stove, and ate slowly while the woods outside grew darker and quieter. When the fire started to die down, I rolled out my sleeping bag on the mattress and climbed in. I read a few pages of an old paperback I brought, then turned off the flashlight and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was completely silent. Not the kind of silence you hear in the city at night, where there's still traffic in the distance or dogs barking. This was real silence. No wind, no insects, just nothing. I laid there for a long time, listening. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I just wasn't used to it. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. When I woke up, it was still dark. My mouth was dry, and I was freezing. The fire had gone out. I got up, added wood, got it going again, then laid back down. That's when I heard it. A soft, crunching sound outside, like something stepping on dried leaves. It wasn't loud, and it only happened once. I held my breath. Nothing, just quiet again. Probably an animal, I told myself. Deer maybe, or a raccoon. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. Nothing unusual. No paw prints. No signs of animals. Just the same quiet woods and a cool breeze. I boiled some water from the rain barrel, made coffee, and ate a protein bar. Then I hiked a short trail behind the cabin that led to a ridge with a great view of the valley. I sat there for hours, staring out at the trees and sky. It was beautiful, still, peaceful, everything I'd hoped for. But when I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. The door was open. I was sure I'd closed it when I left. I always do. I'm the type of person who double-checks locks, even on vacation. The door didn't have a real lock, just a heavy wooden bar you slid into a slot. I knew I'd put it in place, but now it was swinging gently in the breeze. I stepped inside slowly. Everything looked the same at first. Stove cold, sleeping bag still on the bed, food untouched. But I looked closer and realized something had changed. One of the chairs was pulled out from the table. I remembered clearly that I had pushed them both in before I left. I stared at it for a long time, then convinced myself I must have done it without thinking. I told myself to stop being paranoid. It's easy to forget small things when you're alone in the woods. Still, I didn't feel quite right. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the door. I got up twice to check it. Both times, it was still shut. I even placed a stick in the bottom corner so I'd hear it move if the door opened. But nothing happened. No sounds outside. No footsteps. Just silence. The next morning, I went to use the outhouse and found something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints behind it. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human feet. At least 2 sets. One of them had deep heel marks like the person was heavy. The other set was smaller and shallower. Both looked fresh. The dirt was still slightly damp from the morning dew, and the prints were clear. I stood there for a long time, staring. Then I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for more. I found another set of prints leading toward the trees. They vanished into the brush. Someone had been here. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and barred it. My heart was racing. I locked myself inside and sat near the stove, staring at the window. I didn't have cell signal. No one knew exactly where I was except my buddy, and he was out of state until Monday. I thought about hiking out, but the sun was already getting low. It would be dark soon, and I didn't like the idea of walking through the woods with someone, maybe more than one person, out there. I stayed inside the rest of the day. I kept the fire low so no one would see the smoke. Every hour or so, I peeked through the window. Nothing, just trees. I barely ate, just a few crackers and a can of tuna. My stomach was tight with nerves. That night was worse. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, knife in hand, flashlight on my lap. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. Not knocking, tapping, light and fast. I froze. The window was behind me. I didn't turn around at first. I just sat there, heart pounding, breathing shallow. The tapping stopped. Then silence again. I turned slowly, inch by inch, until I could just barely see the edge of the window. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes before crawling to the window and peeking out. Nothing. The woods were black. I couldn't see anything past the tree line. I turned off my flashlight so I wouldn't be seen. Then I waited. That's when I saw it. A person standing just beyond the trees. Not moving, not walking, just standing. They were too far away to see clearly, but I could make out the shape, tall with broad shoulders. They stood perfectly still, facing the cabin. I stared at them for what felt like hours, but they didn't move. Eventually, I blinked, and they were gone. I don't know if they ducked or ran or melted into the trees, but I didn't see them again. I stayed up all night, gripping the knife, barely breathing. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't care how far the hike was. I was leaving. As soon as there was enough daylight, I packed everything into my bag, doused the fire, and opened the door. There were boot prints on the porch. 3 different sizes. One of them looked like my own boots. The other 2 didn't. They were deeper, like the people had been standing there for a while, just watching the door. I stepped outside, heart hammering, and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I walked backwards until I reached the path, then turned and started jogging. I didn't stop for miles. Every sound made me flinch. I kept checking behind me, certain I was being followed, but I never saw anyone. It took most of the day, but I finally reached the dirt road where I'd parked. My Jeep was there untouched. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove until I reached town. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night either. Not until I was home, safe, and surrounded by walls and locks and people. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend what happened, and he laughed at first, thought I was messing with him. But when I showed him the pictures I took of the footprints, he got quiet. Said maybe it was hikers or hunters, but we both knew better. I don't know who those people were. I don't know what they wanted, but I know this, they knew I was there. They came close, too close. They watched me. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they were planning something worse. I'll never know. All I know is I was supposed to be alone out there, but I wasn't, and I never will be again. I took a week off from work because I needed to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down. Early mornings, late nights, and everything in between. I didn't want a beach or a resort. I wanted quiet. I wanted to sit still somewhere away from people, away from traffic, away from everything. So I found this small cabin in a remote part of northern Idaho. The listing said it was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, nestled in the woods, surrounded by mountains and creeks. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. Perfect. I packed up my truck with enough supplies for a week. Cans of soup, instant coffee, bottled water, snacks, a small propane burner, flashlight, batteries, a couple paperbacks, and some gear in case I felt like hiking. I also brought my 9mm pistol, not because I was expecting trouble, but because it's what I do anytime I go deep into the woods. I'd rather have it and not need it than the other way around. The drive up was peaceful. Long stretches of winding roads, patches of fog hugging the valleys, pine trees lining both sides. My GPS lost signal about an hour before I reached the cabin, but I had printed directions just in case. By the time I pulled up to the place, the sun was low and the forest had that calm, golden glow that only comes in the late afternoon. The cabin was small but solid, weathered wood siding, a tin roof, a porch with a single rocking chair. There was a fire pit out front and a field that stretched out maybe 2 football fields in length before the woods picked back up. No neighbors, no noise, just the creaking of trees and the chirping of birds. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the first evening unloading my things, sweeping out the cabin, and getting settled. The inside was simple, just a main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and some shelves stocked with old camping gear. There was no plumbing, but there was an outhouse about 50 yards behind the cabin, and a metal drum outside for catching rainwater. That night, I built a small fire in the pit and sat outside with a blanket, watching the stars come out. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen the sky so clearly. No planes, no light pollution, just an endless black canvas filled with stars. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the crackling of the last bits of firewood burning down. The first few days were exactly what I wanted. I hiked in the mornings, read in the afternoons, and cooked simple meals over the burner. I didn't see a single soul. No cars on the road, no hikers on the trails. Just quiet, and I welcomed it. On the 3rd night, I was sitting on the porch again, sipping a cup of instant coffee when I noticed something odd. Out in the field in front of the cabin, I saw movement. I thought it might be a deer, But as I focused, I realized it wasn't moving like a deer. It was upright, person. I felt my stomach tighten. It was far off, maybe 150 yards, but it was clearly a man, just standing there. No movement, no walking, no waving, just still. I stared for a long time, squinting to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. He didn't move. I eventually went inside, locked the door, and looked out through the window. Still there, standing in the middle of the field. It took me almost an hour to work up the nerve to look again. But when I did, he was gone. The next morning, I walked out to the field just after sunrise. The grass was wet with dew and high enough to reach my knees. I looked around for any kind of footprint or disturbed grass, but I couldn't find anything. No trail, no signs of anyone. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a tree or a shadow. That's what I told myself. That day, I took a longer hike, trying to shake off the nerves. I followed a narrow trail that led up along a ridge, then looped back down through a creek bed. I was out for nearly 5 hours. When I got back to the cabin, something felt wrong right away. The rocking chair on the porch was turned. I always faced it toward the field, but now it was pointing toward the side of the cabin, facing the woods. I stared at it for a long time. I knew I hadn't moved it. I would have remembered. I was certain. I felt that same tight feeling in my chest again. I looked around but saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place other than the chair. That night, I didn't sit on the porch. I stayed inside with the door locked and my pistol nearby. I kept the lights off and peeked through the curtains every now and then, trying not to let my imagination run wild. Around 1 a.m., I looked out and saw him again. Same spot, dead center of the field, just standing there. This time I didn't wait to see if he'd disappear. I kept my eyes on him as long as I could, but he never moved. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, even opened the window a crack to make sure it wasn't just fog or some trick of the moonlight. But it was him, a man, standing still, watching. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up on the floor with my back against the wall. It was morning. I rushed to the window, and the field was empty again. I seriously considered leaving that day, but part of me didn't want to look like I was scared of nothing. I had one of those thoughts that makes no sense but feels important. If I left, he'd win, like it was some kind of challenge. I decided to stay one more night, just to prove to myself it was nothing. I spent the whole day in a strange kind of tension. I stayed near the cabin, kept my pistol on me at all times, and checked behind my back constantly. Every time the wind moved a tree branch or a squirrel scurried across the roof, I jumped. I kept trying to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew something was off. That night, just after sunset, I saw him again. But this time he was closer. Not in the middle of the field, maybe 60 or 70 yards away. Still standing, still watching. I stared at him for what felt like hours. I didn't look away. I wanted to see if he'd move, if he'd do anything. But he didn't. He just stood there. I had the pistol in my hand, safety off. I didn't aim it. I didn't point it. I just held it. At one point I yelled out, even though I didn't expect an answer. He didn't flinch. He didn't wave. He didn't move. Eventually, I closed the door and sat in the corner with the pistol across my lap. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, I packed everything as fast as I could and got the hell out. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I just threw everything in the back of the truck and started driving. When I passed through the field on the way out, I looked once, just to be sure. It was empty. I made it back to town by late morning, and once I had signal again, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was still up. Same pictures, same description. I contacted the owner just to let him know I'd left early, and I asked if anyone else lived nearby or might have reason to be on the property. He said no. The cabin was isolated. No other houses for at least 3 miles. No caretakers, no rangers, no hunters, just me. That confirmed it. I wasn't seeing things. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I kept telling myself it was probably just some nutcase or hiker who liked to scare people. But it didn't sit right. There was something about the way he never moved, the way he didn't respond. The way he showed up in the same spot again and again, always watching. A few months later, I checked the listing again, just out of curiosity. It had been taken down. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know if he was dangerous or just unwell, but I do know I wasn't supposed to see him. That place was meant to be empty, quiet, and he didn't belong there. I haven't gone back into the woods since. Not alone, not even for a day hike. Something about the silence out there doesn't feel the same anymore. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty and watching, like the trees are holding their breath, like someone's still out there, standing in the field, waiting for the next person to show up. I hadn't been back to the old hunting cabin in almost 6 years. It belonged to my uncle before he passed away, and after that, no one really used it anymore. It sat deep in the woods, maybe 20 miles from the nearest gas station. No paved roads led to it, just an old dirt trail that wound through dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely touches the ground during the day. I used to go there with my uncle when I was a teenager. We hunted deer, fished in the creek, cooked over a fire, and sat for hours listening to nothing but wind and birds. It was peaceful back then. But that place started to feel different the older I got. Not haunted or anything like that, just off. Too quiet, maybe, too isolated. I had been living in the city for the past several years, working a desk job, sitting in traffic, going through the same routine every day. I started feeling burnt out. My mind kept drifting to the old cabin. I thought maybe it would help to take a break and just disappear into the woods for a few days. Be alone with my thoughts, no phone, no internet, no one bothering me. So, I packed up some gear, some canned food, my rifle, and a couple changes of clothes. I filled up the truck, printed out a map from the last time I remembered the route clearly, and drove north. The drive took about 4 hours. The last part was slow because the dirt road was in rough shape. Potholes, fallen branches, loose rocks everywhere. My tires kicked up so much dust that I had to keep my windows up. Trees lined both sides of the path so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like I remembered. Maybe a little more weathered, a little more worn down, but still standing. The roof sagged slightly on the left side, and the wooden porch steps creaked under my weight as I walked up to the door. I had brought the key with me, one of those old skeleton-style keys. It still worked. Inside, everything smelled like wood and dust. The cabin was one big room with a bed in the corner, a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a small counter with some shelves above it. I took some time to air it out, open the windows, sweep the floor. Mice had clearly been living in there, droppings in the corners, chewed up bits of insulation. I found a few traps in the storage cabinet and reset them. I spent the rest of the day cleaning and unpacking. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stone fireplace and some soup warming on the portable burner I brought. I ate in silence, staring into the flames, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The first night was calm, cold, but quiet. I heard some rustling in the trees outside, probably raccoons or deer. I slept with my rifle next to the bed just in case. I woke up a few times from the cold. There was no insulation in the walls, but nothing unusual happened. The next day, I spent hiking around the area. I followed the old trail that led to the creek about 2 miles south of the cabin. The water was still clear, flowing gently. I filled up a canteen, skipped some stones, and sat on the moss-covered rocks just listening. There was something comforting about being out there, like time had slowed down. No emails, no news, no buzzing phones. Just trees and water and wind. I found some tracks near the creek. Deer mostly, but one set looked strange. Bigger than deer, too wide for coyote. Could have been a black bear. I wasn't worried though. I had my rifle and some bear spray. Still, I made a mental note to keep the fire burning at night and not leave food outside. That evening, I cooked some canned chili and drank one of the beers I had packed. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the last bit of light slip away behind the trees. It got dark fast. The forest doesn't get city dark. It gets pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face without a flashlight. I sat there until I heard something that made me go back inside. A single loud snap of a branch, not too far off. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like something heavy stepped on it. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, scanning the woods. I didn't see anything. No movement, no eyes reflecting light. But I didn't feel right either. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat for a long time just listening. I didn't hear it again. On the third day, I hiked northeast of the cabin. That part of the forest was thicker, harder to walk through. I found some old hunting blinds we used to use, most of them broken down or full of rotted wood. I noticed something strange as I made my way back. Deep scratches on a tree trunk around chest height. They looked fresh, too high for a coyote or bobcat. I stood there staring at them for a long time. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I took a picture with the old camera I brought, even though I wasn't sure why. I guess I wanted proof in case something did happen. That night was when things started getting bad. I was sitting by the fire again, same routine, eating, reading an old book I found on the shelf, when I heard a noise. It was quiet at first, like footsteps in the leaves. Not a sprint, not a charge, just slow walking. I froze, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I waited, rifle in my lap, barely breathing. I didn't move for almost 20 minutes. Then, just when I started to think maybe it was my imagination, there was a knock on the wall. Not the door, the side wall. One single knock. Solid, deliberate. I stood up, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned off the lantern and stood in the dark, waiting. I didn't move for hours. The knocking didn't come again. No more footsteps. Nothing. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I walked around the cabin looking for tracks, but the ground was covered in pine needles and dry leaves. I couldn't tell if anything had been there. I told myself maybe it was a tree branch falling or a raccoon knocking something over, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. That knock wasn't random. It had weight, felt intentional. I considered leaving, but part of me didn't want to run away from something I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd stay one more night, maybe two, and if anything else weird happened, I'd pack up and leave. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go hiking. I chopped some wood, cleaned my rifle, and made sure everything inside was where it should be. Around late afternoon, I noticed something strange again. A pile of stones about 10 feet from the edge of the trees. It hadn't been there before. 5 smooth rocks stacked carefully on top of each other. Too clean, too precise for something natural. I didn't touch it. I didn't even walk close to it. I just stood there staring at it until I got cold and went back inside. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside the window. Breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Right outside the window by the bed. I didn't look. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart racing, barely able to think. It went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. Then came another knock, this time on the back wall. I waited. No footsteps, no voices, no growling. Just silence. A deep, terrible silence that felt worse than the noise. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the rifle aimed at the door until sunrise. As soon as there was enough light, I went outside. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found the footprints. They were human, bare feet, no shoes, no boots, just dirty, large footprints circling the cabin in the damp dirt behind it. The toes were long, almost stretched out. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the woods. I didn't want to keep going. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the floor, staring at the front window. That was it. I was done. I packed up everything I could carry, loaded the truck, and left before noon. I didn't even clean up. I just got out. About 10 miles down the road, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Another pile of rocks, in the middle of the trail. Same smooth stones, stacked carefully. I didn't stop. I drove around it and kept going. I didn't stop for gas until I was almost back in the city. It's been months now. I haven't told anyone about it. Not really, just hints. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. I still have the photo of the claw marks. I still think about the breathing outside the window, the knock on the wall, the footprints. And the worst part? I don't think I was the only one up there. I think someone lives in those woods. Not a ghost, not a creature. Person. A real person. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who watches, waits, moves at night. Maybe they've been out there for years. Maybe longer. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that cabin again. I've been looking forward to this solo cabin trip for weeks. There's something about getting away from the noise of the city, disconnecting from everything, and just being in the middle of nowhere that felt peaceful. I'd found a cabin online that seemed perfect for what I was after. It was small, tucked deep into a forest on the edge of a lake. It wasn't too far off the beaten path, but far enough to feel isolated. The idea of complete silence, with just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional bird, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed my car the night before, and by the time the sun came up, I was on my way. The drive out there was longer than I expected, but the roads were smooth, and the weather was perfect. The kind of crisp, clear day where the sky looked endless, and the sun hung just above the trees, making everything glow with warmth. When I arrived at the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how remote it really was. There were no neighbors for miles, just thick forest surrounding the area. The cabin itself was small, just a single room with a kitchen in the back and a wood stove for heat. A big stone fireplace in the center of the room gave it that cozy, rustic feeling. It was exactly what I needed. I unloaded my car, hauling my bag and a few food supplies into the cabin. The front porch had a couple of old rocking chairs that looked out onto the lake. The view was incredible, the kind of view you could get lost in. I set up a small fire in the fireplace, put on some music softly, and settled in. I wasn't planning on doing much during the day, just reading, relaxing, maybe taking a walk around the lake. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I took a short hike down to the water's edge. The woods around me were dense, and there was a peaceful stillness in the air. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves as the breeze blew through. The water of the lake was calm, reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was beautiful and I felt at ease. This was the kind of quiet I craved. I spent an hour or so walking along the shore, then headed back to the cabin just as the sky started to darken. The fire inside the cabin was still crackling, casting a warm glow on everything. I made myself some dinner, simple but satisfying pasta with tomato sauce, a salad on the side. It wasn't gourmet, but it was just what I wanted. After eating, I threw a few more logs into the fire, then settled down with a book. It was the kind of night you could really get lost in a good story. But as the hours passed, the mood started to change. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, like the quiet was a little too quiet. First, I brushed it off. It was the middle of nowhere, after all. There was nothing out here. But the more I sat in that room, the more I began to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but every now and then, I would hear something that didn't quite match the natural sounds around me. A twig snapping outside, the faintest shuffle of footsteps. It wasn't until later, when I was getting ready to turn in for the night, that I started to feel something more unsettling. I heard a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. 3 soft raps on the cabin door. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know anyone around here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car drive by since I got here. I stood still for a long moment, just staring at the door. I wasn't sure if I should open it. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone lost? But then, why would they knock and not shout out for help? I didn't open the door, just listened. After a few minutes, I heard nothing. The night was still like it had been before. No more knocks, no voices, no nothing. I locked the door and checked the windows, but nothing seemed out of place. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably an animal or maybe even the wind. Still, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling of being watched. The wind outside picked up, and the cabin creaked as it shifted in the breeze. It felt like the house itself was alive, breathing with me. I went to bed but couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. It didn't help that the wind howled louder outside, sending shadows dancing across the walls. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke up to something that made my heart race. There was a loud noise coming from outside. Not a knock this time, but something much heavier. Something moving around the cabin. It sounded like footsteps. I lay in bed, frozen, straining to listen. There were no lights, just the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the sound. Someone was walking around outside, right next to the cabin. There was no mistaking it now. The sound was too deliberate, too close. My mind raced with every possibility. A hunter? Someone lost in the woods? A prank? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Not that I really expected one, but it added to the growing sense of isolation. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't ask for help if things went wrong. I was alone. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside the window, and for a moment, everything was completely still. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweaty as I waited. My eyes never left the window. The last thing I wanted to do was go over and look outside, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I moved closer to the window, trying to peer out through the cracks in the curtains without being noticed. The moonlight barely lit the outside, but I could just make out the outline of a figure standing by the window. They were tall, thin, and unmoving. My breath hitched as I backed away from the window, my mind spiraling into panic. The footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin, but I didn't dare relax. I lay there for hours, listening to every small noise, expecting at any moment for someone to knock again, or worse, to break in. I don't know when I eventually fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the sun streaming through the trees. It was the next morning that I finally worked up the courage to check outside. I opened the door, half expecting someone to be waiting for me, but there was nothing, just the quiet morning, the lake in the distance, and the rustling of leaves in the trees. No sign of anyone, no footprints around the cabin. It was like nothing had happened. I couldn't explain it, and that unnerved me more than anything. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the windows, making sure everything was locked. But nothing happened. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I sat by the fire, trying to shake off the unease. I reminded myself that I was probably just being paranoid. It wasn't uncommon for people to feel jumpy in remote places like this. But as I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I heard it again. 3 knocks, soft and steady, just like the night before. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my things, slammed the door open, and ran for the woods. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I made it back to my car in record time and didn't stop until I was miles away. The rest of the drive home was a blur, my mind still replaying the strange sounds, the figure outside my window, and the feeling of being watched. I don't know if it was a person, a wild animal, or just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing I knew for sure, I'd never return to that cabin. Not ever. And now, as I sit here writing this, I still don't understand what happened. But I do know this: there are things in the woods, and sometimes the best thing you can do is leave them be. I had been driving for nearly 5 hours when I first saw the turnoff. It was marked only by an old wooden sign with faded letters pointing into the forest. The main road had thinned out miles ago, and now the narrow gravel path looked almost like it hadn't been used in years. The tires of my pickup crackled over the loose stones as I slowed down and made the turn. I felt my stomach shift slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from that quiet uneasiness that comes when you're going somewhere you've never been alone. I had rented the cabin for a week through a Forestry Service website. It wasn't a typical Airbnb or anything like that. It was one of those old logging cabins, deep in the backcountry of northern Montana, originally built decades ago for timber workers and now used for remote getaways. It was advertised as secluded, rustic, and perfect for solitude. No electricity, no cell service, Just a wooden structure with a wood stove, bunk bed, and an outhouse out back. I was excited. I had grown tired of people, of noise, of screens and traffic. I wanted to disconnect. I wanted to be somewhere real. The road wound deeper through the trees, cutting through thick forest with towering pines pressing in from both sides. Patches of snow still clung to the shady spots even though it was late April. My phone had lost signal about an hour ago. A rough map had been printed from the website and was sitting on the passenger seat, but the instructions had been clear enough. Follow the gravel road for 11 miles after the turnoff, then park near a gate and walk the rest of the way in. It took another 30 minutes before I saw the gate. A rusted chain link barrier stretched across the road with a Forest Service property. Authorized access only, sign dangling from the middle. I parked off to the side, threw my pack on, grabbed my food cooler from the bed of the truck, and started walking down the old logging trail. It was cool in the shade of the trees. My boots crunched through leftover snow, wet pine needles, and old mud that had hardened in ruts from tires years ago. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but heavy quiet, like the forest had sucked up all the sound and was just waiting. I had walked nearly 40 minutes before I saw the cabin. It sat in a clearing ringed by thick trees on all sides. The roof slanted low, half covered in moss and leaf debris. The walls were made of rough, dark wood, and the front porch leaned slightly to the right. There was a metal chimney sticking out the top with rust stains trailing down the side. A small woodpile sat under a makeshift lean-to, already stacked neatly. It looked old, weather-beaten, but still solid. It looked exactly like what I had wanted. I stepped up onto the porch, keys jangling from my pocket, and unlocked the heavy padlock on the door. It creaked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet woods. Inside, it smelled like old smoke, pine, and thyme. Dust floated in the streaks of sunlight coming through the small, grimy window. A bunk bed sat against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a small table with a couple of chairs in the middle. There was a shelf with some old cans and tools, a tin basin for washing, and a cabinet with some leftover dry goods, matches, salt, and canned beans mostly. I dropped my pack and cooler, let out a breath, and sat down on the bottom bunk. The first couple of days were exactly what I had hoped for. I chopped some wood, gathered kindling, cooked simple meals on the wood stove, read a paperback book I brought, and wandered a bit along some of the old paths behind the cabin. At night, it got cold, but the stove worked well and I had brought enough warm gear. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone. Just the crackle of the fire, the groan of old wood settling, and the wind pushing through trees outside. It was late on the third night that things started to shift. I had been asleep in the bottom bunk. The stove had died down, and I woke up from a strange feeling. Not a sound, not even a dream, just a sense of being watched. It was pitch black inside, so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I sat up slowly, listening. The trees outside moved with a soft breeze, and I heard the usual creaks of the cabin's old frame. But something felt off. I stayed still, holding my breath, ears straining. Then I heard it, a very soft crunch outside, like a footstep in frozen dirt. Then another. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed. It wasn't an animal. I had heard plenty of those. Squirrels and birds during the day, the distant calls of coyotes at night, even the snapping branches from deer or elk moving through. This wasn't like that. It was slow, deliberate, and it was close. The steps stopped. I stayed sitting in the dark for maybe half an hour, heart beating hard, listening, but nothing else came. Eventually, I lay back down, not sleeping, just watching the dark until morning. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe even my imagination. But when I walked out to the outhouse that morning, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Prints in the mud around the side of the cabin. Not boot prints exactly, but close. Worn tread, like an old hiking boot, leading around the side and toward the trees. I hadn't walked there. I followed them into the woods for a bit, maybe 40 or 50 feet before they disappeared into harder ground and old snow. I stood there for a while, looking at the trees, feeling that tightness in my chest again. Then I turned around and went back inside. That night, I triple-checked the door lock and pushed one of the chairs under the doorknob. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds, not loud, just enough to keep me on edge. A branch snapping here, a creak from the porch, something brushing the wall. Every sound felt deliberate, like someone was testing the place. I lit the lantern and sat up for most of the night, holding the axe I had used to split wood. In the morning, I walked the area around the cabin again. More prints, a few near the edge of the clearing. One of them was fresh, right outside the window where I slept. That day, I didn't eat much. I didn't wander far. I kept the axe nearby, listened hard for anything strange. The forest felt different now. Less empty, more alert, like it was listening back. That night, I kept the lantern lit. I didn't try to sleep. I stayed sitting at the table with my back to the wall. Around 2 a.m., I heard something on the porch. Not just a footstep this time. A slow dragging sound, like someone sliding a foot or maybe something being moved. Then the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. Slowly, turned once, then again, then stopped. I stood up quietly and held the axe in both hands. My mouth was dry. I didn't say anything. I didn't move toward the door. After a long pause, the knob released. Then footsteps, this time walking away across the porch. Down the steps, into the woods. I stayed up until dawn. As soon as it was light, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had 3 days left. I stuffed everything into my pack, loaded up my cooler, and didn't even stop to eat. I moved quickly, looking over my shoulder constantly. I walked fast, back down the trail toward the gate where my truck was parked. But when I got there, I stopped cold. My truck was there, but the driver's side door was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I approached slowly, every sense on edge. There was no one around, but the air felt wrong. The inside of the truck had been rummaged through. Glove box open, maps pulled out. Even the bench seat had been cut, like someone was looking for something inside. Nothing was stolen that I could tell, but everything had been touched. I climbed in, turned the key, started. I backed up fast, turned around, and started driving down the gravel road as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, an hour later. I didn't call the police. What could I say? No one ever hurt me. Nothing was taken. No faces, no names. Just a feeling, just a presence, just something or someone out there. But I knew I was being watched. Not just at night, not just around the cabin. I think I was being followed. Even now, back home, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and check the doorknob. I was looking forward to the weekend all week. Work had been draining. Long hours, the usual office chaos, and the constant buzzing of emails and phones. I needed quiet. Not the kind you get by just turning your phone off, but real silence. The kind you find far away from everyone else. A friend of mine had told me about this off-grid cabin deep in the mountains, a place he'd stayed at a few years back. No signal, no roads after a certain point, no other people nearby. It sounded perfect. Just trees, sky, wind, and the creaking of old wood. Exactly what I needed. The place wasn't easy to get to. I had to drive about 4 hours out of town, most of it on winding 2-lane roads, and the last part was up a narrow gravel path that climbed steeply through thick forest. I parked my car at a small clearing where the road ended, then hiked the last mile and a half to the cabin. The air felt different up there. It was cooler, cleaner, and had that deep pine smell that hits you like a memory from childhood. The trail was narrow and winding, and the forest closed in on both sides. It was quiet except for birds and the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. When I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. It was small, old, and clearly hadn't been used in a while, but it stood solid. The porch sagged slightly, and the wood had darkened with age and weather, but it looked strong. It had one main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchen area with some shelves, and a narrow back room that looked like it was meant for storage or maybe sleeping bags. No electricity, of course. Just a few lanterns, a water pump out back, and an outhouse about 20 yards away through a path in the trees. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked around the place, checking everything. I wanted to make sure I knew every corner before the sun went down. I opened and closed every door, looked under the bed, checked the little storage room, and walked around the outside to see what was behind and under the cabin. There was a small woodpile stacked neatly behind it and a rusted axe leaning against the wall. I was relieved to find it stocked with dry wood. Whoever had stayed here last had been considerate. After unloading a few things, I started a small fire in the stove and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the popping and crackling. I didn't plan to do much. Maybe read a little, eat something easy, and go to sleep early. It was so quiet. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin settling. When night came, it got dark fast. Real dark, the kind you don't get in towns or even suburbs. I lit 2 of the lanterns and placed one near the bed and one near the front door. I didn't feel scared, just alone. I liked it. The air was cold outside, and I could hear the wind picking up a bit more. I layered up, made a quick meal on a little camp stove I'd brought, and sat in silence as I ate. That first night was peaceful, but I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, not from noise, just that sense you get when you're in an unfamiliar place. Every creak felt louder. Every gust of wind felt closer. I kept looking toward the window near the bed even though the curtains were drawn. I had a weird feeling that someone might be standing out there watching, but I told myself that was just my brain making up stories because of the silence. Nothing happened, and I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I woke up to light coming through the cracks in the curtains. It was cloudy and cold. I stepped outside to stretch and breathe in the fresh air. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and there were no signs of animals or people. I drank some instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and walked a little beyond the clearing to explore. The forest felt endless. No trails, no footprints, no broken branches. Just tall trees, dry leaves, and that deep quiet. I went back, split some wood for later, and settled in to relax. That afternoon, things started to feel strange. I noticed it when I walked out to the outhouse. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, and they weren't mine. I stood over them for a long time, staring. They were deep and pointed toward the cabin. I looked behind me. My own tracks were off to the side, still visible from yesterday when I made the first trip. These new ones were fresh. I followed them a few steps, but they vanished into the hard ground near the trees. I stood there for a while trying to think. Maybe someone had come up to check the place? Maybe a hunter? But I hadn't heard anything. No engine, no footsteps, nothing. I told myself it could have been from earlier and I just hadn't noticed, but I didn't believe it. They were too clean. Back inside, I kept checking the window. I closed the door tighter and pushed the latch into place, though it wouldn't hold much if someone really wanted in. I sat on the bed and waited. An hour passed, then another. I made a small fire just to have something to look at. The light helped, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Right as the sun was going down, I heard a sound outside. A branch snapped, not like a little twig. This was heavier, like a foot on dry wood. I froze and turned off the lantern. My heart was pounding. I stood in the dark, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone circling the cabin slowly. Leaves crunching, a soft step, then stillness. I didn't have a weapon, just the axe outside and a folding knife in my backpack. I slowly crouched and reached under the bed for the backpack. My hands were shaking as I pulled the knife out and opened it. I crouched by the wall, listening. I couldn't see anything out the window. It was pitch black. I waited, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. The wind moved through the trees, but nothing else. I stayed there for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have dozed off sitting up. When I woke, it was early morning and the sky was gray. I stood slowly and stretched. Everything felt stiff. I looked out the window. Nothing. I opened the door and stepped out, expecting to see signs. More prints, broken branches, but there was nothing obvious. I walked carefully around the cabin. Near the side wall, I found one deep boot print. Just one, pointing toward the front door. Whoever it was had stood there, listening, maybe watching. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed close to the cabin and kept the axe inside with me. I locked the door and kept checking the windows. Nothing happened, but the pressure never lifted. I didn't feel alone anymore. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern off and lay with the knife under my pillow. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a sound or think I saw a shadow. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave. I started packing as soon as it was light. I didn't want to stay another night. I packed my bag, filled my water bottles, and was ready to go by 10 a.m. But when I stepped out to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh prints again right up to the window. Whoever it was had been standing there during the night, only inches from where I'd been sleeping. I didn't waste time. I threw the pack over my shoulder and started down the trail fast, keeping the axe in one hand. I walked hard and fast, barely stopping. My nerves were on fire. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it was closing in. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone following. It took longer than I remembered to get back to my car. The trail twisted and climbed, and I was moving faster than before. When I reached the clearing, I felt a moment of relief until I saw the car. The back window was smashed, and the glove box had been emptied. Someone had been in it. I walked slowly around to the driver's side, keeping the axe ready. There was nobody there, but the door was cracked open slightly. I looked inside. Nothing of value was missing, just ransacked. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I drove the winding roads fast, barely blinking. When I reached the nearest town about an hour and a half later, I stopped at a gas station and went inside. I didn't say anything at first, just stood there, shaken. Then I asked the clerk if I could use the phone and called the local police. I reported everything, what I saw, what I heard, the break-in. They sent someone to meet me. I talked to a deputy for nearly an hour. He took notes, asked questions. He told me, carefully, that they'd recently been looking for someone who'd escaped from a nearby correctional facility. A man convicted of armed robbery, someone desperate and dangerous. He said they had reason to believe he was hiding somewhere in the hills. My stomach turned. It made sense. The footprints, the silence, the watching. He said they'd send a unit to check the cabin, but warned me not to go back. I didn't argue. I never did go back, not even to collect the rest of my things. A few weeks later, I got a call from the same deputy. They'd found signs that someone had been living near the cabin. An old tarp, food wrappers, and a small fire pit. But no one was there when they arrived. Just silence and the cold, empty forest. I think about it sometimes, especially at night when the house creaks or the wind taps on the windows. That feeling of being watched never really left me. I still keep a flashlight and a knife next to my... I've never been one to shy away from solitude. In fact, I've always found peace in the quiet of nature. So, when I decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin in the woods, it felt like the perfect way to unwind. The cabin wasn't far from where I lived, tucked away in a dense forest, far enough from any major roads or towns to ensure I wouldn't be bothered. It had been advertised as a rustic escape for those seeking peace and quiet. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the air crisp with the promise of fall. The trees, painted in shades of amber, orange, and red, made the drive out feel like something out of a postcard. The cabin itself was small, almost primitive looking, nestled at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick woods. It looked just like the photos. Wooden, with a small porch and a stone chimney, the kind of place you could lose yourself in. The owner of the cabin had given me directions via text, and I had no trouble finding it. I parked my car and grabbed my things. The key was hidden in a small box beside the door, just as described. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A stone fireplace stood as the centerpiece of the living room, and the old wooden floors creaked beneath my boots. There were a few mismatched pieces of furniture, a well-worn couch, and a table with 4 chairs. The kitchen was sparse but had everything I'd need to cook. A tiny bathroom at the back completed the space. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in, trying to make myself comfortable. I was planning to stay for 3 nights, so I didn't want to rush things. I lit the fireplace and enjoyed the warmth of the fire crackling as I sat back on the couch with a book. The light from the flames danced across the room, casting long shadows against the walls. As night began to fall, I went outside to gather some firewood from the small pile next to the cabin. The forest around the cabin was dense, and the trees blocked most of the remaining daylight, but it didn't feel intimidating. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like the woods were alive with stories. I found myself enjoying the peaceful solitude. However, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods around me seemed to change. The shadows grew longer, and the wind, which had been a gentle breeze earlier, started to pick up. The rustling of the leaves felt almost deliberate, like something was moving in the dark. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the silence could easily play tricks on the mind. That night, I cooked a simple meal and ate in front of the fire. Afterward, I decided to go to bed early. There was something calming about being in a place like this, far removed from the noise of everyday life. The bed was comfortable enough, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. I woke up around 3 a.m., disoriented, as if something had pulled me from a dream. The air in the cabin felt colder than it had before. I lay still, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet. But then I heard something faint. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps seemed to circle the cabin, as if whoever it was pacing around, waiting. I told myself it was just an animal, a bear or a deer, perhaps. Still, the sound was unsettling. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but there was no signal. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and there was no way anyone would be able to reach me. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, to ignore the sound, but it was impossible. The steps continued for what felt like hours. Each time I tried to calm myself, the sounds grew louder, closer, like whoever was out there was testing the boundaries of the cabin. My heart raced, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At one point, I heard a low thud against the side of the cabin. I was too scared to look, but I could hear the movement of someone, or something, scraping against the walls. Eventually, the sounds stopped. No more footsteps, no more thuds, just silence. But the silence was different now. It was thick, oppressive, like the air had changed. I lay there for what seemed like hours, not daring to move, not daring to even breathe too loudly. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. The sun rose slowly over the treetops, casting soft light into the cabin. The warmth of the day made the chill from the night before fade away. I decided to ignore what had happened, chalk it up to my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been alone in the woods, and the mind can do strange things when it's left to its own devices. I spent the rest of the morning outside, hiking along a small trail that ran behind the cabin. The woods were peaceful in the daylight, the trees creating a canopy overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There were no signs of life except for a few birds and the occasional squirrel darting between the trees. The further I went, the more isolated it felt, but in a good way. It was quiet and calming, exactly what I needed. When I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something odd. There was a small mark on the doorframe just above the lock. It wasn't much, just a faint scratch, barely visible, but it was enough to catch my attention. It looked fresh, as if something had scraped it recently. I tried to think of what could have caused it, but I couldn't come up with anything reasonable. My mind immediately jumped to the previous night, but I quickly dismissed the thought. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent the evening cooking dinner and reading, trying to push any lingering feelings of unease out of my mind. As night fell, I decided I would stay up later tonight, just to make sure nothing strange happened again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt like I needed to stay vigilant. At about 2 a.m., the sounds returned. Soft at first, just a faint rustling outside, but it grew louder, more deliberate. There were no footsteps this time, but something was definitely moving around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I told myself it was just an animal. There was no reason to panic. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. I I stood up quietly, grabbing the small flashlight from the counter. I didn't want to make any noise, didn't want whatever it was to know I was awake. Slowly, I crept to the window and peered outside. I couldn't see anything at first, just the darkness of the forest. But then there, moving between the trees, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with broad shoulders. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The figure stood still for a moment, almost like it was listening. I pulled away from the window and backed into the corner, keeping low. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't a person. Couldn't have been. There was something off about it. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. I waited in the corner for what felt like hours, the silence suffocating. But eventually, I heard the figure move again, this time retreating back into the woods. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I grabbed my things, my jacket, and my phone. I didn't care that there was no signal. I just needed to get out of there. I rushed to my car, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. I started the engine, threw the car into gear, and sped down the narrow road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. In fact, I haven't gone back to the woods since. What happened that night still haunts me, and I'll never know if what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination. But one thing is for sure, there are things in the woods that I'll never understand, and sometimes it's better not to ask questions. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the stress of city life. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my partner and I decided to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere. We'd heard about this spot from a friend, a secluded cabin near a small, barely known lake, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to turn orange with the onset of fall. The idea sounded perfect. We left early Friday afternoon, and after a few hours of driving, we finally arrived. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. It sat back in the woods, just far enough from the road to feel isolated, but still close enough to be accessible. I could already feel the stress lifting as we unloaded our bags, took in the crisp air, and settled into the place. The kind of quiet you get in a secluded area, where the only sounds were birds calling and the wind rustling through the trees, was a luxury we both needed. That first night was peaceful. We made a small fire in the fireplace, had dinner, and spent a few hours just relaxing. But as the night went on, a strange feeling settled over me. I couldn't quite place it, like the stillness of the place was too quiet, as though something was just waiting in the background, watching. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The wind picked up as the hours passed, making the trees outside creak and groan. It didn't help that the cabin, though charming, wasn't exactly weatherproof. Every gust of wind seemed to rattle the windows, and the sound of branches scraping against the roof added to the eerie atmosphere. I kept telling myself it was just nerves. I'd been cooped up in the city for too long. The isolation was getting to me, but when I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to fall back asleep, I knew something was wrong. I lay in bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening. The wind was howling now, and the trees outside were almost howling along with it. But it wasn't just that. There was a sound coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, faint but distinct. Something moving, something heavy, like footsteps crunching on the forest floor. At first, I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. The area was known for wildlife. But this sound, whatever it was deliberate. Slow, methodical, like someone was walking just outside the cabin, just out of sight. I lay there frozen, straining my ears, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the noise didn't stop, kept going for what felt like hours, until I could almost hear it breathing. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, like someone was just waiting for the right moment to step closer. I tried to shake it off, but sleep didn't come. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I told myself it was just the first night in a strange place. I was overthinking it. I had to be. We spent the next day exploring the area. The sun was out, the sky clear, and the lake looked beautiful in the daylight. We went for a walk along the shore, skipping stones and taking in the scenery. The stillness of the place was calming, and I started to feel better. But when we got back to the cabin that afternoon, something had changed. The air felt thicker, as if the atmosphere itself had turned heavy. I tried not to think about the sound from the night before, but I couldn't help it. It nagged at me, tugging at the back of my mind. Later that evening, when the sun set and the light turned amber, I found myself watching the forest outside the window. It was so dark now, the trees black silhouettes against the night sky. I noticed movement again, deeper in the woods, just a flicker, like something darting between the trunks. A shadow. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then the movement stopped, like whatever it was had noticed me. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. The woods weren't just the woods. It felt like they were closing in around me. That sense of being watched was stronger now. But when I tried to shake it off, I felt stupid. There was no reason to be afraid. I was just overreacting. But then we heard it again. The sound. At first, it was faint, like it had been the night before. A distant crunching, a heavy footstep. But then it grew louder, closer. I could hear it now just outside the cabin. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling the house. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the windows, but I didn't see anything. My partner and I sat in silence, listening. The sounds came again, closer now, and they weren't stopping. The worst part was that they didn't sound like footsteps anymore. They sounded like something or someone was dragging itself across the ground. The low, scraping noise echoed through the still air. We decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The darkness outside felt impenetrable, and every snap of a twig made my heart race. We walked around the cabin, flashlights in hand, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. The noise stopped, as though whatever it was had vanished. That night, we locked all the doors and windows, and I made sure everything was secure. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave. I didn't want to stay in that cabin anymore. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of view, was too much for me to ignore. My partner was skeptical at first, but after seeing my anxiety, he agreed we should leave. As we were packing the car, I caught a glimpse of something in the woods. Movement, quick and deliberate. I didn't even think. I jumped in the car and we left. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. We drove the long way home, and as we passed the turnoff to the cabin, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest stood still, quiet and untouched. I almost expected to see something there, watching us, but it was just trees, and the road behind us disappeared. It wasn't until we got home that I could finally relax. The tension in my shoulders finally eased, and the tightness in my chest went away. I tried to forget about the cabin, the strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. But every so often, when the wind howls outside at night, I remember the sounds from the woods, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was watching never really left. It started with a break I thought I needed. I'd been working overtime for months straight. My eyes were always sore from staring at screens, my back hurt from sitting, and I was losing my mind from the noise of the city. One Friday night, after finishing up a long week, I booked a small cabin about 3 hours out from where I lived. I found it online, some rental in a quiet area near a lake, surrounded by forest. The photos looked peaceful. A wooden porch, a small dock out on the water, a wood-burning stove inside, and not much else. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, no people, no stress. That was the plan. I packed up the next morning. I didn't need much, just some clothes, a cooler of food, a flashlight, my phone, though it wouldn't have service, a book, and a hunting knife I kept in my glove box. It was more for peace of mind than anything else. I filled the car with gas, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and left the noise behind. The drive out was beautiful. Trees everywhere, the road narrow and curving gently through the hills. I passed only a few cars. The last half hour was a dirt road, bumpy and lined with tall pines. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the cabin. It sat alone by the edge of a still lake. No other houses in sight. There was a gravel driveway, a shed out back, and a canoe turned upside down near the dock. The porch was old but sturdy. When I opened the door, it creaked like something out of a movie. The place smelled of wood and dust. It was simple. One room with a bed, a small table, a couple of chairs, a stove, and a narrow door leading to a bathroom. No mirrors, no decorations. Just the basics. I unpacked, opened the windows, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the wind ripple across the water. The silence was unreal. No cars, no yelling, no sirens. Just the sound of the breeze and some birds. For the first time in months, I could hear my own thoughts. That night, I made some pasta, read for a bit, then sat on the dock in the dark. The stars were bright and clear. I stayed there a long time, listening to the soft lapping of the water. Eventually, I went to bed, the sound of crickets fading as I drifted off. The next morning was quiet again. I made eggs on the stove, sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, and planned to go for a walk in the woods. There were trails nearby, and I figured I'd explore. I packed a backpack with water, a snack, and a flashlight just in case. I also took the hunting knife. Not that I expected trouble, but it felt better having it. The trail was narrow and ran along the side of the lake, then curved up into the trees. Felt good to move, to breathe clean air. I hiked for about an hour, saw a couple of deer, and even stumbled across some old logging equipment rusting under a tarp of moss. It looked like no one had touched it in years. Eventually, I circled back and got back to the cabin by mid-afternoon. The sky was clouding over, so I stayed in and read. Later, I made dinner and went to bed early. The first 2 days passed like that. Peaceful, quiet, relaxing. But by the third night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was already in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard it. A soft crunching noise outside, like someone stepping on dried leaves. I sat up, holding my breath, waiting. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and slower, not like an animal, more deliberate. Step, pause, step. I got out of bed slowly, heart starting to beat faster. I crept over to the window and peeked out. I couldn't see much, just trees, some moonlight, and the dark outline of the dock. I waited. A minute passed. 2. Nothing. I started to think I imagined it. Maybe a branch fell or the wind shifted. I told myself not to be stupid and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I woke up groggy. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. I didn't see any clear footprints, but the ground was dry and covered in pine needles. Hard to tell. Still, something felt off. That night, I locked the door and pulled the curtains. I kept the flashlight next to my bed and the knife under my pillow. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. Same slow steps outside. This time, they stopped right near the porch. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. After a long minute, I got up and crept to the window again. I looked out. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside the cabin, near the edge of the porch, I saw what looked like a shoe print. A human one. It wasn't fresh. It was faint, barely pressed into the pine needles. But it was there. Definitely not mine. I had been wearing boots, and this looked like a flat shoe, like a sneaker or something. That was the moment the peace shattered. I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe someone else had stayed here recently. But the cabin was remote, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. My mind started racing. What if someone was watching, hiding in the woods? I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Could be nothing. Could be paranoia. I stayed one more night, but I didn't sleep. At one point, I swore I heard breathing outside the window. Not footsteps this time, just soft, steady breathing. I lay there in the dark, every muscle locked. I clutched the knife until my hand hurt. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up fast. It was still early, sun just coming up. I locked the cabin and loaded my car. But when I tried to start it, nothing happened. Dead. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was fine the day before. Lights still worked, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I opened the hood, looked around, but I didn't know much about cars. I checked the fuel gauge, still half a tank. I tried again. No luck. That's when I saw it. The wires. Someone had cut the engine wires. Clean slice. Not chewed, not frayed, cut. With something sharp. I backed away from the car slowly, my stomach turning. My eyes scanned the woods. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But I knew someone had been near my car. Someone didn't want me to leave. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and pulled the curtains. I looked at my phone, no service. Of course, I felt trapped. I paced the room, thinking. The nearest town was miles away. I could walk, but it would take hours, and I wasn't sure which direction to go. The road wasn't easy to follow on foot. Then I remembered the canoe. If I could paddle across the lake, I could maybe find help or at least get to another road. I grabbed the paddle from the shed, dragged the canoe to the edge of the water, and loaded it with the basics: knife, flashlight, water bottle, and my phone just in case. I didn't take the cooler or much gear. I wanted to travel light. I pushed off and started paddling. The lake was quiet, the water calm. I stuck close to the shore at first, just in case. Trees lined the edge, dense and shadowed. I kept glancing back at the cabin. It looked small and harmless, but I knew better now. Halfway across the lake, I heard a sound, a splash, then another. I stopped paddling and listened. My heart was pounding again. It sounded like someone wading into the water from shore. I turned around and saw a figure standing knee-deep near the edge. A man, just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't make out his face. He wasn't running, wasn't yelling, just watching. I turned and paddled faster. I didn't look back. I reached the other side after what felt like forever. I dragged the canoe onto land, heart racing, and started walking. The woods were thicker here, the trails less clear. I moved fast, not stopping. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted distance. Hours passed. My legs hurt. I drank all my water. I kept listening for footsteps behind me. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap, but I didn't stop to check. I kept moving. Eventually, I stumbled onto a gravel road. I nearly cried when I saw it. I followed it until I reached a gate with a mailbox. A cabin. A real one with a truck parked out front. I knocked hard on the door, and when no one answered, I went to the shed and grabbed a tool to pry open the truck. I didn't care. I needed to get out. The truck keys weren't inside, but the door was open. I found a charger for my phone, plugged it in, and prayed for service. 2 bars. Enough. I called 911. When the cops arrived, I told them everything. They searched the cabin I had rented. They found footprints, cut wires, even the spot by the lake where someone had stood. But no one was there. Whoever it was, he was gone. Later, they told me the cabin had been rented a few times before. One man had reported weird noises. Another said his tires were slashed. But no one ever caught the guy. No one knew if he lived in the woods or just passed through. They said it could have been a drifter. Maybe I had been planning the cabin trip for months. Work had been wearing me down, and I just needed to unplug from everything. My phone had become more of a leash than a tool, and I hadn't had a quiet night to myself in over a year. When I finally got a week off in mid-October, I booked a remote cabin in the northern part of Michigan, about 3 hours from where I lived in Grand Rapids. It was listed on a small rental website that specialized in out-of-the-way places. The photos showed an old wooden cabin tucked into a thick pine forest. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no neighbors. That was exactly what I needed. I packed my old Jeep with groceries, some firewood, a few paperbacks, and some basic gear in case I decided to do a little hiking. I left early on a Wednesday morning. The weather was cool, but the sun was out, and the leaves had just started turning shades of orange, red, and yellow. The drive was peaceful. Once I passed Cadillac, the towns got smaller and the roads narrower. Eventually, I turned onto a gravel road that wound through dense trees and didn't see another car for almost half an hour. There were no signs, just coordinates and a short description from the owner saying the cabin was at the end of the road, past an old logging trail. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly like the photos. It was small, made of weathered gray wood with a rusted metal roof. The porch sagged a little, and the chimney had some moss growing on the side, but it looked sturdy enough. I grabbed my backpack and stepped inside. The interior was simple. A single room with a bed, a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen area with a propane cooktop, and a bathroom with a composting toilet and a big metal water tank for washing up. There was a big window facing the woods and a dusty armchair in the corner. It smelled like old wood and pine needles. I loved it instantly. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, chopped some kindling, and made a fire in the stove to take the chill out of the air. I read for a while and went for a short walk down the trail that led away from the cabin. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, just far enough to get a feel for the area. There was no sign of anyone else being around. No trash, no footprints, nothing. When I got back, I made a simple dinner, lit a few candles, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The stars came out in full force, clearer than I had seen them in years. The silence was complete, except for the occasional rustle in the trees or the hoot of an owl. The second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I packed a lunch and filled a thermos with coffee, then set out after breakfast. The logging trail went on much farther than I expected. After about an hour of walking, I came across an old, rusted-out pickup truck abandoned by the side of the path. The doors were gone, and moss had grown over the tires. It looked like it had been sitting there for decades. A little farther down, I found the remains of what might have been a logging shack, just some rotted boards and a metal barrel. I stopped and had lunch near a small stream, then headed back before the light started to fade. That night, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Nothing specific, just a slight discomfort, like I was being watched. I kept looking toward the woods as I sat on the porch, but I didn't see anything unusual. The fire crackled behind me in the stove, and I tried to focus on my book, but I ended up heading to bed earlier than usual. I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered doing the night before, and kept the hatchet I'd used for chopping wood next to the bed, just in case. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. There was a sound outside, faint but sharp, a snapping twig or a footstep on dry leaves. I sat up and held my breath. The cabin was completely dark except for the dying glow from the stove. I didn't move. The sound didn't come again. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it had just been a raccoon or maybe a deer. I laid back down and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I walked around the cabin just to make sure everything was normal. Nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed something strange down the trail. About 20 feet in, a small pile of rocks had been stacked deliberately on the side of the path. I hadn't seen it before, and it wasn't natural. It looked like a small cairn. I knocked it over, figuring it might have been there all along and I just missed it, then headed back. Later that day, I went out again, this time sticking to the trail but walking a bit farther. I wanted to see how deep the logging trail went. I followed it for a long time, probably another hour and a half, until the trees began to thin out slightly and I found a clearing. In the middle was what looked like another old building, this one made of stone. It was more intact than the other ruins I'd seen. It had no windows and just a single door hanging half off the hinges. I went inside and found a fireplace, a broken chair, and some old glass jars. It looked like someone might have stayed there at some point. I didn't like the vibe of the place. Something about the thick walls and the smell of mildew made me uneasy. I didn't stay long. When I got back to the cabin, I was exhausted. I made dinner and tried to relax, but again, I had that same feeling. This time it was stronger. I kept hearing small sounds outside, rustling, snapping branches, even what sounded like a low murmur once or twice. I stayed inside and didn't light the porch lantern. When I finally went to bed, I pushed the dresser in front of the door. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Once, I thought I heard breathing right outside the window. Another time, something thumped against the wall. I was starting to regret coming out here. I just kept telling myself I was imagining things. my mind playing tricks. In the morning, I found more stacked rocks near the trail. 3 separate piles this time. I hadn't walked that way since the day before. They hadn't been there. I was sure of it. I knocked them over again. I thought about leaving early, but I was stubborn. I told myself I had nothing to be afraid of. It was just nature, maybe a bear or maybe some local messing around. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin, gathering more firewood and reading, but I kept checking over my shoulder, and I couldn't shake the idea that I was being watched. That night, everything escalated. I went to bed around 10. Around midnight, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone walking on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up, heart pounding. I waited, listening. The steps stopped, then I heard the door handle rattle. I had locked it, and the dresser was still in front of it, but it kept rattling for several seconds. Then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing as quietly as I could. Then I heard footsteps circling the cabin, leaves crunching. Pause. Then another thump against the wall, this time harder. I grabbed my flashlight and the hatchet and sat up the rest of the night. I didn't sleep at all. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't dare look outside. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt, clear as day. They circled the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw it into the Jeep, and drove out of there without even stopping to eat breakfast. I didn't look back. I didn't report anything. Who would I report it to? There was no crime, no face, just some stacked rocks and boot prints. I never found out who or what was out there. Maybe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe they didn't like outsiders. Maybe it was someone living off the grid, watching anyone who came close. But I learned something important. Remote doesn't always mean peaceful. Sometimes, being out there completely alone isn't freeing. It's exposing, vulnerable. I still love the woods. I still go hiking, but I never go alone anymore. And I don't rent random cabins off backwater websites. That trip gave me what I thought I wanted: silence, isolation, a break from the world. But it also taught me that some places are quiet for a reason. Some places don't want company, and I won't ever go back to that cabin. Not now, not ever. The wind was relentless, howling through the trees, rattling the windows of the cabin. The cabin was small, tucked away in the middle of the woods, far from the nearest town. It was supposed to be peaceful, just a weekend escape from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I'd been here once before, a long time ago, with friends, but this time it was just me. The idea was to get away, have some alone time, and clear my head. It was supposed to be quiet. The isolation wasn't so much unsettling as it was refreshing at first. I had everything I needed: enough food, a comfortable bed, a pile of books, and a bottle of whiskey for when the mood struck. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. There was a wood stove for heat, a small kitchenette in the corner, and a single bathroom with running water. The walls were made of thick logs, and the floors creaked when you walked. It had an old charm to it, rustic and cozy. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The drive was long, winding through narrow, unpaved roads that were barely visible in the fading light. But I'd been looking forward to this. It had been a stressful few weeks, and I needed some time to myself. The isolation felt like a blessing, a chance to recharge without the noise of the world pressing in. I unpacked my things, settled in, and made myself comfortable. The first few hours were peaceful, too peaceful almost. I spent the evening reading and drinking, the warmth from the stove mixing with the whiskey, making me feel drowsy. I closed the curtains, and the outside world seemed to disappear completely. There was no noise, no traffic, just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of silence that could make you feel both at ease and uneasy. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The air was cool, and the bed felt soft beneath me. As I lay there, the house groaned and shifted, as old houses tend to do. The wind continued to howl outside, louder now. I pulled the blanket up and closed my eyes, hoping to drift off quickly, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself straining to listen. There was something strange about the sounds outside. It wasn't just the wind anymore. I heard something else. A crack, like a branch snapping. Then a thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. My heart started to race. I convinced myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the noise seemed too close. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the unease lingered. I didn't want to get up and investigate. I told myself that whatever it was probably harmless. Still, I kept listening, straining to hear through the walls of the cabin. The sounds continued, branches snapping, something moving in the dark, just out of sight. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin that my heart dropped into my stomach. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a tree branch brushing against the wood. But then it came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate scraping. Couldn't place it. My eyes were wide open now, staring into the darkness of the room, my ears fixed on the sound outside. It went on for a while. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the noise was too persistent. It felt intentional, like whatever was out there was trying to get my attention. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an animal? Person? The thought of someone else out there, watching the cabin, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to get up and investigate. I didn't want to believe that something or someone was out there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart in my ears. Slowly, I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. I pulled back the curtain just enough to get a glimpse outside. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing at first. The darkness outside seemed impenetrable, the trees swaying in the wind. But then something moved. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for me to make out. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? It was hard to tell. All I could see was movement, a flash of something in the corner of my vision. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to leave, to grab my things and run, but I didn't know where I would go. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. My phone had no signal. I was completely isolated. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow disappeared. I waited for a long time, hoping it was just my imagination. But the silence that followed only made the situation worse. The wind had died down, and there was no sound at all. Nothing but the beating of my own heart. I stayed by the window for a while, watching the darkness. Nothing moved. No more shadows, no more sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, I went back to bed. But sleep didn't come. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, listening for any noise, any hint that something was out there. My mind kept racing, going over the events of the night. Was I just imagining things? Or was someone really out there? Hours passed, and I finally drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise. The cabin was quiet again, the strange noises from the night before seemingly forgotten. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next day trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I went for a walk around the cabin, trying to find some comfort in the fresh air and the sunlight. But even during the day, something felt off. The woods seemed too still, too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, anyone, watching from behind the trees. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted. I didn't want to spend another night in the cabin, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The roads were too treacherous at night, and I didn't want to risk driving through them in the dark. So I stayed. But this time, I took precautions. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them just to be sure. I sat by the stove, keeping the light on, hoping that whatever had been out there would stay away. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up the next morning, the strange feeling was gone. The cabin felt normal again. I packed my things and left, not wanting to spend another moment there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still standing, as quiet and still as it had always been. But I couldn't help but wonder, what had really been out there in the woods, and why had it watched me? I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just too isolated, too alone. But I don't think I'll ever know for sure. I rented the cabin because I wanted a break from everything. Life had been getting to me. Stress from work, too many people in the city, the noise, the traffic, the phone's always buzzing. I just needed some quiet, something simple. I looked online for places in the mountains, far from towns, where I wouldn't see or hear another soul for days. I found a small cabin way up north, deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It didn't have Wi-Fi or cell service, which was perfect. It had a small kitchen, a bedroom, a fireplace, and a front porch that looked out over the trees. It was exactly what I needed. I drove up early one Friday morning in late October. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the weather was cool but not freezing yet. The gravel road leading to the cabin twisted through the woods and climbed slowly uphill for miles. I passed a few old signs that were barely standing and spotted maybe 2 other cabins along the way, but both looked abandoned. No cars in sight, windows boarded up, and roofs half collapsed. I reached the cabin around noon and parked beside it. There was no other car, no neighbors nearby, no noise at all. Just trees, tall, bare trees stretching for miles. The cabin was even more remote than I expected. The front porch had an old wooden rocking chair and a small bench with chipped paint. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside it smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove and a sink, a table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace with a pile of logs beside it. The bedroom was through a narrow doorway, just a bed with a heavy quilt and a tiny window that looked out into the woods. The place was old but clean. There were no mirrors, no clocks, nothing extra. Just the basics. I unpacked my bags and set everything up. I had brought enough food for the weekend and a bit extra, mostly canned stuff, rice, and some meat in a small cooler. I also had a camping stove and lanterns, just in case the propane or firewood ran out. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and candles the owner had left behind. I lit a fire in the fireplace and opened a can of soup. As it warmed, I sat on the front porch and looked out at the woods. There was nothing. No movement, no wind, no animals. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. At first, that kind of silence is peaceful. But after a while, it starts to feel strange, like something is missing. I kept telling myself that this was what I came for. No noise, no people, just quiet. That first night was cold. The fire helped, but it went out by early morning and I had to get up to light it again. I hadn't brought a watch, and my phone was off. I just went by the light outside. I walked a bit after breakfast, just along the gravel road, not too far from the cabin. I didn't want to get lost. The trees were close together, the branches bare and scraping against each other when the wind picked up. I saw a few deer prints in the mud, and some small holes in the ground that might have been made by rabbits or foxes. Nothing big, no people, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had come down that road in a long time. That night, something woke me up. It was a faint sound, like wood creaking, but not from inside. It sounded like it came from outside, maybe near the porch. I lay still for a while, holding my breath. I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer walking close. But the creaking wasn't like footsteps. It was slower, rhythmic, almost like the rocking chair. I sat up and listened harder. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin was pitch dark except for that faint red light. The sound kept going, a slow back and forth. I didn't have the courage to open the door. I just sat there listening. After a while, it stopped. I waited longer, still nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe making the chair rock. But there was no wind. The trees hadn't moved all day. I finally fell asleep again just before sunrise. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked at the chair. It was still. I looked around the clearing in front of the cabin but saw nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something had made that noise. Maybe an animal brushed against it. Or maybe I dreamed it. I left it alone. I didn't want to ruin the whole trip by freaking myself out. That afternoon, I went for a longer walk. I followed the gravel road down a hill and around a bend I hadn't explored yet. After maybe 20 minutes, I saw something in the trees. At first I thought it was a shadow, but when I looked closer, I saw a small trail leading off the road. The path looked old and narrow, almost hidden by fallen leaves. I followed it for a bit just to see where it went. It led down into a shallow dip between two hills, and at the bottom was a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a burned cabin. The walls were still standing, barely. The roof had caved in, and everything inside looked black and broken. The fire must have happened a long time ago, because there was moss growing up the sides and no fresh ash anywhere. I didn't go inside. I just stood there, looking at it, wondering what had happened. I didn't see any signs, no fences, nothing to show it had belonged to anyone in particular. I took a few steps closer and saw something near the doorway, an old chair, almost identical to the one on my porch. It was blackened but still standing. I don't know why, but that made me feel uneasy. I turned around and walked back fast. I didn't run, but I wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up and made the trees creak. I kept thinking about the burned cabin and how far it was from mine. I remembered that the listing said there were no other cabins within 5 miles. That one had been closer. I figured maybe it wasn't there when the listing was made, since it had burned down. But I didn't like how the path to it was hidden, like it wasn't meant to be found. Just after midnight, I woke up again. I heard the rocking chair. It was slow, back and forth, back and forth. I didn't move. I just stared at the bedroom doorway. The fire was out. The cabin was dead quiet except for that one sound. It lasted longer this time, 5, maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped. I got up and looked outside through the window, trying to see the porch. It was too dark. I couldn't see anything. I closed the curtains and went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I went out and looked again. Nothing. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there. The ground was covered in dry leaves and pine needles, so I knew I probably wouldn't see anything. Still, the chair was slightly turned. Not by much, just enough to make me feel sure it had moved. I picked it up and moved it inside the cabin. I set it against the far wall, facing the fireplace. Then I stacked a few empty boxes on top of it so I'd know if it moved again. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some firewood, read a book I'd brought, and tried to keep my mind from wandering. Felt like the air had changed, like something was wrong now, and I was just pretending everything was fine. Around sunset, I locked the door and blocked it with the heavy bench from the porch. I didn't think anything would happen, but I felt better knowing it wasn't just the latch keeping it closed. That night, I didn't hear the chair, but just after I fell asleep, something else woke me up. It was a sound from outside, but not near the cabin. Came from the woods. A sharp, dry cracking sound, like a branch being snapped in half. Then another, then nothing. I sat there in bed, holding still, listening. A few minutes later, another crack. Closer. I stayed awake for hours, listening to those slow, irregular sounds. They never got too close, but I knew they weren't random. Something or someone was out there. The next morning, I walked out to the edge of the woods, about 30 yards from the cabin. I found 2 broken branches on the ground, freshly snapped. One still had green inside. That meant it wasn't just falling from age. Something had stepped on it or broken it on purpose. I didn't go any farther. That was my last full day at the cabin. I had planned to stay until Monday morning, but I made up my mind to leave early. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to find out what it was. I packed most of my things that afternoon and kept the rest ready by the door. That night, everything was quiet for a while. Too quiet. No wind. No trees creaking. Not even the usual sounds of small animals in the woods. Around 2 a.m., I heard the boxes fall. I jumped up and lit the lantern. The chair had moved. It was turned, just a bit, like someone had sat in it and shifted. The boxes had fallen to the floor. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard anything but the crash. I checked the door. Still locked. The bench still pressed against it. The windows were shut. Nothing made sense. I didn't sleep again. I sat in the corner with my back to the wall, holding a heavy piece of firewood like a bat. I stared at the chair until the sky started to lighten. When it was finally bright enough outside, I grabbed my stuff and got in the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I drove away as fast as I could down the gravel road. I didn't stop until I reached the main road 2 hours later. I got back to town and checked. I found the cabin listing online. It was tucked deep in the northern woods of Minnesota, near the edge of a small, almost forgotten lake. The place didn't have many reviews, but the few it did have were positive. The price was low too, which should have been a warning. It wasn't much more than $100 for 4 nights, but I wasn't thinking about red flags. I just needed to get away. I'd been overworked for months, and my head had been a mess. Too much time spent staring at screens, too many people crowding into my life every day, too much noise in the city. I wanted to sit still. I wanted quiet, just woods, water, and solitude. So I booked it. I packed 3 days of food, a backpack of clothes, my fishing rod, some simple gear, and enough bottled water to last the trip. I didn't even bring a firearm, even though I usually carry something on trips like this. I didn't think I'd need it. The area wasn't known for bears or wolves, just deer, squirrels, and mosquitoes. The drive was long, almost 8 hours with only a few stops. I got off the interstate and kept going deeper and deeper into the woods. For the last hour, my car barely made it down a narrow dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Trees crowded the edges. Branches scraped against the sides of the car. My GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on a printed map the cabin owner had emailed to me. I almost missed the turnoff. There was no sign, just a half-rotted wooden post with an arrow carved into it. When I finally reached the cabin, I was struck by how isolated it felt. There wasn't another structure in sight. No other cars, no people, just trees and the dull shimmer of the lake through the gaps in the pines. The place was smaller than I expected. Wooden planks grayed by age and weather, a slanted metal roof rusted along the edges, and one single window in front with cracked panes. There was a small porch with a rocking chair that creaked in the wind. A thin trail led down to the water. I stepped out of the car and just stood there, listening. No traffic, no voices, not even birds, just the breeze shifting through trees. Felt like I'd stepped out of time. I unlocked the front door using the key I'd found under a loose stone, just like the listing said. The door stuck a little, but I managed to shove it open. Inside, the place smelled like dust and dry wood. Everything was old. The floorboards groaned when I walked. There was a small couch, a wooden table, a gas stove, a cooler-sized fridge running off propane, and a narrow bed pressed against the far wall with a thin mattress and a scratchy wool blanket. There was no plumbing, just a rust-stained sink with a hand pump for drawing water from a tank outside. The bathroom was an outhouse 30 yards behind the cabin. Still, it had what I needed. I unloaded my stuff, put my clothes in a corner, stacked my food in the cabinet, and set my fishing gear by the door. I cracked the one small window and let in the cool pine-scented air. After that, I stepped back outside and walked to the edge of the lake. The water was still, not a single ripple. A low mist hung near the surface, and I could see dragonflies hovering in the silence. The woods on the other side were dense, unbroken, not even a trail. I didn't see a single boat, not a dock, not even a ripple from a fish. The air felt heavier out there, but I chalked it up to nerves. New place, long drive, sudden isolation. That first night, I made some canned soup on the stove, sat on the porch, and watched the sun drop below the trees. The temperature dropped fast after dark. The wind died down. I lit a lantern inside, locked the door, and crawled into bed. I didn't fall asleep easily. The cabin made a lot of noises. Creaks, groans, subtle pops like the wood was shifting. Normal for a structure that old. I tried not to think about how alone I was. Somewhere after midnight, I heard a sound that made me sit straight up in bed. It was faint, distant, but not part of the wind or the building. It sounded like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. Nothing at first. just the wind stirring through the trees again. Then I heard it a second time. Crunch, a slow, dragging step in the leaves. Then another, then silence. I stayed in bed, frozen, every nerve wide awake. I thought about looking through the window, but I didn't want to give away my position by lighting up the room. I sat there for almost an hour before I finally laid back down. I told myself it had to be a deer, or maybe an old tree limb falling. Nothing else made sense. I slept in bursts, waking up every hour. The next morning, I was groggy and irritable, but I tried to shake it off. I made coffee on the stove, ate some granola, then grabbed my rod and headed to the lake. I spent a few hours casting and reeling, pacing along the shore, trying to settle my nerves. I didn't catch anything, but the fresh air helped a little. Around noon, I walked back to the cabin to eat lunch. That's when I noticed something strange near the porch. There were tracks, boot prints, human. They weren't mine. The treads were different. Mine had a flat heel. These had a deep, sharp V pattern. And they were fresh, edges clean, not rained on or faded. They started from the tree line across the dirt path and led right up to the porch. Then they circled the cabin once and vanished back into the woods. I stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to convince myself they were old or left by someone before me. But the leaves hadn't even settled into them yet. They were recent, maybe hours old. I didn't have cell service and I couldn't call anyone. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of driving back down that narrow, overgrown road after dark made me hesitate. Maybe it was just someone else camping nearby, wandering around. But that didn't explain the silence, or why they came right up to the cabin and circled it. The rest of that day, I stayed alert. I didn't go back to the lake. I kept the door locked even during the day. Every now and then I stepped outside to look around, but I never saw anyone. No voices, no movement in the trees, just that same stillness that felt heavier with each hour. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I kept the lantern on low and sat up most of the time, listening. At one point, just after 2 a.m., I heard something brush against the cabin wall. Not hard, just a scrape. Then another. It moved slowly from one side to the other. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then silence. I waited until daylight before I opened the door again. I checked the ground. More boot prints, same tread pattern, and this time I saw marks on the side of the cabin wall. Not claw marks, just a spot where dirt and bark had been rubbed off, like someone leaned against it or dragged a shoulder. That morning I packed my gear and decided to cut the trip short. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted to get out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I could see the issue almost immediately. My battery cables were cut. Clean, sharp slices. No fraying. Nowhere. Not an animal. Someone had done it on purpose. I stood there in silence, trying to understand what that meant. Someone had come up to the cabin in the middle of the night and sabotaged my car. That meant they knew I was alone. They knew I'd be trapped here. And now I started going over every possibility. Could I hike out? Maybe, but I had no cell signal and no clear trail. It was at least 10 miles of forest to the nearest logging road, maybe more. I could go along the dirt path I'd driven in on, but it would take all day, maybe longer, and I didn't know if the person who cut my cables would be waiting along the way, or worse, following me. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to think. I only had enough food for 2 more days. Same with water. Around noon, I heard something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was metal, a clink like a hammer tapping something. Then a second one. Then silence. Came from the tree line. I peeked through the corner of the window, careful not to move the curtain too much. I saw a man standing at the edge of the woods. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, facing the cabin, arms at his sides, dressed in a heavy jacket and jeans. I couldn't make out his face. He stood there for almost 2 minutes. Then he turned and walked slowly back into the trees. I didn't see him again that day. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern off, sat in the corner with a hatchet in my hand, and just listened. Every little noise felt louder. the groan of the roof, the whisper of wind through the cracks. But nothing came. The next morning, I gathered my bag, packed water and food, and left. I didn't wait. I just walked down the dirt path the way I'd driven in, hoping to reach the logging road and flag someone down. My plan was to keep walking until I found help or signal. The woods were thick. Sunlight barely reached the ground. About 3 hours into the hike, I saw something on the trail ahead. It was a piece of paper nailed to a tree. I needed a break from everything. Work had been wearing me down for months. I was living in a constant loop of noise, traffic, late nights at the office, and early mornings that came way too soon. I couldn't remember the last time I had a real weekend off, so I planned a trip to a remote cabin in northern Michigan. I booked it for a full week, right in the middle of October when the leaves would be peaking. No family, no friends, no phone service. Just me and some quiet. The cabin was located near the edge of a large forest preserve, a few miles from a barely populated town. I didn't know the area well, but the photos showed a sturdy, weathered cabin with a wood-burning stove, a little deck out back, and a view of the trees that stretched for miles. It wasn't fancy, but that's what I wanted. Something basic. Something where I could wake up with the sunrise and hear nothing but wind moving through trees. I packed light, just the essentials, some clothes, non-perishable food, water, a couple of books, a first aid kit, my hunting knife, and a small hatchet. I also brought a hand-cranked radio just in case. I filled the gas tank and made sure my spare tire was in good shape. I didn't want to be stuck somewhere with no help around. The drive took most of a day. As I moved further north, the roads got smaller and the towns farther apart. The trees were a mix of oranges, reds, and yellows, and the air had that crisp bite that let you know summer was officially over. The GPS lost signal about an hour before I reached the cabin, but I had printed out directions ahead of time. Eventually, I found the long dirt road that led off the county highway. It was rough and mostly mud with patches of gravel. My tires crunched over fallen branches and dead leaves. The path curved and twisted deeper into the forest, the tree canopy thickening above me until the road looked like a tunnel of gold and amber. The cabin sat on a small clearing near the bottom of a ridge. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Dust on the windows, dead leaves packed along the edge of the deck, and a slight sag to the roof, but it seemed solid. I parked beside it, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a minute. No sound but the ticking of my cooling engine. No planes overhead, no sirens, just stillness. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove in the main room, and a narrow stairwell leading to a loft with a bed. The bathroom was an outhouse about 30 feet behind the cabin. There was no running water, but there was a hand pump nearby, and I had brought plenty of bottled water anyway. I lit a few candles and unpacked my gear, then took a slow walk around the property. The forest was thick but beautiful. Huge hardwood trees towered overhead. There was a small trail that disappeared into the woods behind the cabin, barely visible beneath the fallen leaves. I followed it for about 10 minutes before turning back. I didn't want to get lost, especially with the sun starting to drop. That night, I built a fire in the stove, heated some soup, and read by candlelight. I fell asleep early, wrapped in flannel and listening to the fire crackle. It was peaceful, just what I needed. The next morning was quiet again. I made coffee on the stove and sat out on the deck, watching the fog lift off the trees. I spent the day hiking a little, chopping wood, and clearing some debris off the trail. I was finally starting to feel normal again. My phone was dead by then, but I didn't care. But on the third night, I noticed something weird. I woke up just before dawn to a sound. It was faint but sharp, a snap, like a dry branch being stepped on. At first I thought it might have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I laid still, listening. Then I heard it again, and then another one. Not fast, just one snap every 20 seconds or so. It sounded like it was coming from the woods behind the cabin. I stayed in bed for a while, but after 10 minutes of silence, I went downstairs and looked out the back window. I couldn't see anything. The forest was still half covered in fog, and the trees were packed tight together. There was nothing out of place, but something about the quiet made me uneasy. I pushed it out of my mind. Probably an animal. I tried to enjoy the rest of the day, but I kept glancing at the tree line. That evening, I double-checked the door locks and brought my knife upstairs with me, just in case. The next night was worse. It was just past midnight when I woke up again. This time to footsteps, not animals. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I just laid there in the dark, heart pounding. The steps stopped for a few seconds. Then I heard the creak of the deck boards. I sat up and grabbed my knife, moving quietly to the window. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel someone out there. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. No more footsteps, no more creaking. I stayed awake until sunrise. That morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't see any tracks, but the ground was covered in leaves. I checked the trail again. Nothing, but something was off. I felt watched. That whole day, I kept expecting something to happen. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept my knife on me at all times. That night, I barely slept. The fifth day, I finally found something. Near the trail, about 50 yards from the cabin, I spotted a tree with a long scratch down one side. Fresh. The bark was torn, and there were marks in the dirt like something had slipped or kicked. I started noticing other signs too. Branches broken at shoulder height, a bit of cloth caught on a thorn bush. It looked like someone had been moving through the woods. I didn't go any farther. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and built a fire. I wanted to leave, but I had no cell signal, and driving back at night on those roads would have been dangerous. I told myself to wait until morning. Just one more night. That night was the longest of my life. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time closer, slower. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, listening to whoever it was circle the cabin. I heard them stop near the window. I didn't breathe. Then I heard the doorknob move. Just a soft rattle. Then silence. I sat like that until dawn. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed everything. I threw it all in the truck and got out of there. The dirt road was slick and I slid a few times, but I didn't stop. Not until I hit the highway and saw other cars. I drove all the way home that day. When I got back to the city, I plugged in my phone and checked the local news. Nothing about anyone missing or prowlers in that area. I didn't report it. I couldn't even describe what had happened clearly. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen. But I knew what I felt. I still think about it. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were watching me, maybe waiting. I'm glad I left when I did. I still go hiking. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, never that far out, and never again in a place where help is more than a shout away. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a week to myself, but something was wrong out there, something real, not a ghost or monster, just a person, and I think that's scarier than anything else. Started out as a short break from my usual routine. I had some vacation days saved up and I was feeling burnt out from work, the noise of the city, and just life in general. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far enough from everything so I could breathe a little. I found a cabin listing online that looked just right. It was in northern Michigan, tucked back from the highway, surrounded by woods, and right near a small lake. No neighbors in sight, no cell service, and the photos made it look simple but clean. Just a small log cabin with a dock and a boat. I booked it for a week. I drove up early on a Saturday morning, leaving before sunrise. The farther north I went, the quieter everything got. The radio lost signal halfway through the drive, and I didn't bother trying to find another station. I just enjoyed the quiet. By the time I turned off the main road onto a long gravel driveway, I hadn't seen another car in about 30 minutes. The cabin was smaller in person, but it looked the same as the pictures. Weathered logs, green metal roof, small porch with a couple of old chairs, and a fire pit out front. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a narrow trail that led down to the water. The lake was about the size of a football field, perfectly still, with a small dock and a rusty metal rowboat tied to it. Inside, the place was simple. One main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and a little table by the window. There was a small bathroom with a compost toilet and a gravity-fed sink. No running water. I brought plenty of jugs with me, so it wasn't a problem. There was a shelf with a few old books, a stack of firewood, and a note from the owner saying to keep the boat tied up and lock the cabin when I left. I unpacked, started a fire in the stove to knock the chill off, and settled in. The first day was peaceful. I walked down to the lake, sat on the dock, and watched the water. It was completely silent except for the wind in the trees. I rowed out for a while, let the boat drift, then came back and made dinner. That night I sat by the fire pit and watched the stars. I hadn't felt that calm in years. No emails, no phones, no deadlines. Just trees and water and sky. The second day I explored the woods a bit. There were old animal trails, deer tracks, and I even found some small mushrooms growing in the shade. I took pictures, not planning to pick anything. Around midday I heard a noise, like a branch breaking, but I didn't see anything. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. The woods were thick, and even a small animal could sound big when moving through brush. That night, I built another fire outside and cooked on it. The air was crisp, but not too cold. I didn't see any wildlife, but I heard movement a few times deeper in the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder. I told myself it was just animals. Probably was. The third day was when things felt different. I woke up around 6, made coffee, and opened the door to let in some fresh air. I noticed something strange right away. The rowboat was no longer tied to the dock. It was about 10 feet away, floating loose. The rope was still there, just dangling in the water. I thought maybe I didn't tie it tight enough, but I remembered double knotting it. Still, it was windy overnight. Maybe the knot slipped. I waded into the cold water, grabbed the boat, and pulled it back, tied it again. This time I wrapped it twice around the post and made sure it was tight. I even tested it by tugging on it hard. It held. Later that day, I took a longer walk into the woods. I followed a trail that looped around the lake and came out near the other side. There was a small clearing, maybe an old campsite, with some rotted logs and ashes from an old fire. I sat for a while just listening. It was quiet, but I kept having the sense that I wasn't alone. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I felt watched. It made my skin crawl. I left after about 10 minutes and made my way back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the fire pit. They weren't mine. I had boots on, but these were bare feet, bigger than mine. Deep impressions, like whoever made them was heavy. I stared at them for a long time. I walked around to see if maybe I left them without realizing it, but they didn't match up. They went from the edge of the woods toward the cabin, then stopped. No returning prints, like someone had come close, then disappeared. I looked around, didn't see anyone. My chest tightened. That night, I locked the cabin door and pushed a chair under the handle. I kept the fire going and stayed inside. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, hearing things outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, I heard something knock against the wall. Not an animal. It sounded like a hand. In the morning, the boat was loose again. This time it was farther out, drifting toward the center of the lake. The rope was cleanly cut. Not frayed, not broken, cut. I rode out with a branch and pulled it back, heart pounding. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a motor, nothing. I packed up that day. I knew I still had time left, but something was wrong. I didn't want to be there anymore. I loaded my things into the car and walked back to lock the cabin. That's when I found the new footprints. This time they circled the cabin. Twice, bare feet, no shoes, no socks. And this time they were fresher. I could still see the outlines clearly. I got in the car and drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I hit the next town with cell service. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for 20 minutes trying to calm down. I thought about calling the owner, but what would I say? That someone had been near the cabin? That a boat got untied? That I felt watched? It didn't seem like enough. That night I stayed in a motel. Couldn't sleep. I kept looking at the window, checking the lock. The next day, I drove straight home. Weeks passed. I didn't tell anyone at first. I felt embarrassed, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the footprints, about how quiet it had been, like someone knew how to move without being heard. I kept imagining someone barefoot, heavy, tall, just watching from the trees, close enough to walk to the cabin, circle it, and disappear without a sound. Eventually, I did tell someone, a coworker who liked camping. He asked me for the location. I gave it to him. He looked it up and said he couldn't find the listing. I checked myself. The website was gone, just an error page. I tried to find the owner's name in my email. Nothing. My booking confirmation was missing, vanished. I still had the pictures I'd taken on my phone. The cabin, the lake, the dock, but no paper trail. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they lived nearby or if they were watching the place for a long time. Maybe it was just bad timing. Maybe I stumbled onto somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. But I'll never forget that feeling. Standing in the quiet, looking down at those footprints, and knowing I wasn't alone. Knowing they were barefoot in the woods just watching. I haven't gone camping since. It was the second week of October when I took time off work and drove out to a remote part of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. I needed the quiet. Things had been getting to me. The city, the work stress, too many people and not enough silence. I rented a small off-grid cabin I found on a rental site. The pictures looked nice enough. It was deep in the woods, near a river, and came with a wood stove, a cot, a small table, and a fire pit outside. That was all I needed. I packed a few changes of clothes, food that wouldn't spoil, a few gallons of water, my camping gear, and my hunting rifle. I wasn't gonna hunt, but I liked to have it with me when I was far off alone. It gave me peace of mind. The drive from my place in Lansing took about 7 hours. I made a few stops for gas and a last-minute grocery run. As I left the highway behind and got deeper into the woods, the road narrowed to a gravel path lined by tall pines and trees that were beginning to turn gold and red. It was beautiful in that cold, quiet way the North has. The sun was already low when I pulled up to the cabin. It looked older in person. The wood siding was weathered, and moss crept up around the base. There was a small porch with 2 wooden steps and a creaky-looking door. I parked my truck a few feet from it and took a moment to listen. The wind rustled the leaves, and I could hear the river faintly beyond the trees. Other than that, there was nothing. No cars, no voices, no planes overhead. Just quiet. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. The cot was in one corner, thin but neatly made with a wool blanket. The table and a single chair sat under a small window. There was a counter with a few shelves above it, an old propane lantern, and a large metal bin for dry goods. The wood stove stood near the center with a pile of firewood stacked beside it. I unpacked slowly, putting everything in its place. I lit the lantern, then started a small fire in the stove. I ate a cold meal of canned chicken, crackers, and an apple. Afterward, I sat for a long time just listening. It was the kind of silence that feels thick. Not empty, just full of very small things. I slept light that first night. I wasn't scared, just unused to it all. Every crack or rustle outside made my ears perk. But eventually, I dozed off. The next few days were peaceful. I hiked along the river, followed old logging trails, took photos of the changing leaves. I didn't see another soul. There weren't even old tire tracks. On the 3rd day, I found an old deer blind maybe a mile from the cabin. It was half-rotted and falling apart. I sat there for a while just watching the woods. It felt like I was in a forgotten pocket of the world. That was exactly what I wanted. But that night, something shifted. It was small at first. I was asleep when I woke up to a sound. Something had knocked over the firewood pile next to the stove. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and reached for my flashlight and rifle. The lantern was off. I always turned it off before sleep to save fuel. I grabbed it, flicked it on, then swept the beam around the room. The wood pile had toppled. A few logs had rolled out onto the floor. I checked the door, still locked. No broken windows. I figured maybe I didn't stack the wood right. Maybe the heat from the stove caused some logs to shift. I told myself it was nothing. I restacked the pile, stayed up for an hour, then went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and saw something odd. Near the side of the cabin, there were small divots in the dirt, like someone had walked around, but not with shoes. Bare feet. Not full prints, but enough of an impression to notice. I crouched down and looked closer. The ground was hard, so the marks were shallow. I couldn't even tell how many there were. It just looked like something had moved around in circles. I felt that tight pinch in my gut. Not full fear, but something close. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looked for more tracks. There were a few broken branches near the tree line, but nothing clear. I didn't see any wildlife either. No birds that morning, no chipmunks, not even squirrels. Just that weird stillness. By that afternoon, I convinced myself it could have been an animal. Maybe a bear nosing around. I cleaned my rifle and kept it loaded. I made my meals, sat by the fire pit, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. That night, it was harder to sleep. I kept the lantern on low. I don't like wasting fuel, but I needed the light. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was clear. Footsteps outside. Not heavy, light, slow, like someone walking barefoot on dry leaves. My blood turned cold. I sat up slowly, grabbed my rifle, and held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the cabin. I kept waiting for a knock or a voice, but there was nothing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then I heard the steps again, circling the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. I stayed awake until daylight. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped outside, rifle in hand. I looked for tracks. There were faint marks, like before, but not enough to follow. Whatever it was, it didn't leave a trail. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I forced myself to stay. I told myself it could still be an animal. I walked out to the old deer blind again, just to get away from the cabin. But even the woods felt different now. It felt like something was just behind the trees, watching. I didn't see or hear anything, but my body knew. That night, I locked the cabin up tight. I moved the wood pile in front of the door. I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard a thump, not at the door, at the wall. A solid hit, like something throwing itself against the boards. Then another, and another. I held my rifle and stared at the wall, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to fire blindly. Then it stopped, just like that. Nothing for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't take a last hike. I shoved it all in the truck and drove. I didn't even look back. It took me most of the day to get home. When I finally walked into my apartment, I felt like I hadn't breathed in a week. I took a long shower and collapsed on the couch. I didn't tell anyone, not for a while. It's been months now, and I still think about it. I went over everything in my head 100 times. I checked maps, looked for houses or cabins nearby. There weren't any. The nearest road was almost 5 miles away. There were no signs of squatters, no garbage, no fire rings. Nothing that said someone had been living out there. I don't believe in ghosts, and I didn't see a monster, but something was out there. Someone maybe, I don't know if it was just some backwoods drifter messing with me or someone dangerous who thought I'd be an easy target. Either way, I was lucky. I left before anything worse happened. I still have the rifle. I still go camping, but never alone, and never that deep again. That cabin is still listed for rent. Same pictures, same description, but I won't ever go back. Some places just aren't meant to be lived in, not by people like me. I had been looking forward to a quiet week away from the city. Work had been nonstop for months, and I hadn't taken a break since the previous fall. When I finally put in for time off, I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I just wanted to be alone for a while, away from traffic, emails, and the constant buzzing of my phone. I booked a small cabin up north through a listing I found online. It looked older, maybe built in the 70s, but it was surrounded by woods, far from other homes, and it had electricity and running water. That was enough for me. The drive was long. I left early in the morning and took mostly back roads, stopping once for gas and a sandwich. As I got farther from town, the roads narrowed and the houses disappeared. Eventually, I turned onto a gravel road that twisted through dense trees. I drove slow, watching for the mailbox number listed in the rental details. After what felt like forever, I saw a rusted metal box with faded numbers nailed to a leaning post. I turned into the dirt driveway, which dipped into the woods and curved around a thick cluster of trees before finally opening up to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, made from dark, weathered wood with a tin roof that looked like it had seen a few decades of storms. The windows were all shut tight, and a little chimney poked out of one end of the roof. There was a small porch with 2 wooden chairs, both covered in leaves. I parked next to the cabin, turned off the engine, and just sat for a few seconds. It was quiet. Not just quiet like in the suburbs, but a deep, total kind of quiet. No voices, no cars, no airplanes overhead. Just wind through trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen with an old stove and fridge, a living area with a couch and wood-burning stove, and a bedroom with a twin bed and a dresser. The bathroom was off to the side and had a shower stall and an old toilet that groaned when I flushed it. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, but it wasn't unpleasant. Just the kind of smell you'd expect in a place like this. I spent the first day settling in. I brought food, water, a few books, and some firewood just in case. There was no TV, no cell service, and no internet. That was the point. I made a sandwich for dinner, sat on the porch until the sun went down, and went to bed early. The night was colder than I expected, so I piled on an extra blanket and fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing the cabin walls. The second day, I explored the woods a bit. There was no marked trail, but I followed a dry creek bed and found a clearing with fallen logs and soft moss. It felt untouched, like nobody had walked through there in years. I stayed out for a couple of hours, then headed back before it got too dark. That night, as I was reading in bed, I heard something knock against the side of the cabin. Not a loud bang, just a soft, hollow tap, like someone knocking once with a knuckle. I froze and listened, but it didn't happen again. Probably a branch falling or an animal brushing past. I tried not to think about it. The next few days went by quietly. I read, wrote in a notebook, went on short hikes, and kept the wood stove going at night to stay warm. But I kept noticing small things that made me uncomfortable. On the 4th morning, I found the back door slightly open, even though I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I chalked it up to the old frame and the wind. On the 5th day, I spotted what looked like a set of footprints in the dirt just off the porch. They were faint, maybe a day old, but definitely not mine. I hadn't worn boots with that kind of sole. I started paying closer attention. Each night, I double-checked the doors and windows. I moved a chair in front of the back door. I even placed a small stick on the porch steps to see if it would be moved. The next morning, it was gone. No wind could have taken it, not the way I had wedged it into the gap. On the 6th night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside, twigs snapping, dry leaves crunching. I tried to tell myself it was just wildlife, maybe deer, raccoons, or even a bear. But the noises seemed to stop whenever I sat up or looked out the window, like something was watching the cabin, circling it. By the 7th morning, I was ready to leave, even though I had booked 2 more days. I started packing, folding clothes, dumping out old food, trying to shake the growing anxiety that had taken hold of me. Just before I grabbed my bag, I heard something in the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Footsteps. I went completely still. I waited by the window and watched. After maybe a minute, I saw someone through the trees. They were standing still, half hidden by the trunks. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a figure. They didn't move. I waited, hoping they'd go away, but they didn't. I didn't have a weapon, just a fire poker and a small hatchet I used for splitting kindling. I grabbed both and locked myself in the cabin. I didn't have cell service, and the old landline inside didn't work. I remembered trying it the first day, just out of habit, and getting nothing. I stayed in the living room with the blinds drawn and my back to the wall. Hours passed. I didn't hear anything else. When the sun started to go down, I peeked through the blinds again. The figure was gone. The woods were quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair with the fire poker in my hand and the hatchet on the table. I kept the lights off and listened. Sometime around midnight, I heard the porch steps creak. Slow, careful footsteps. I didn't move. My heart felt like it would explode. I heard the doorknob jiggle softly, then silence. The next morning, I left. I didn't care that I had already paid for the rest of the week. I stuffed my stuff into the car without folding it. I didn't even bother checking the cabin again. I just wanted to leave. As I pulled out of the driveway and back onto the gravel road, I looked in the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone. It took me a while to feel normal again. When I got home, I didn't talk about it for a few days. Then I reported the incident to the site I booked through. They said they'd investigate, but I never heard back. I checked the listing a few weeks later, and it was gone. Now, when I think back, I try to piece it together logically. Maybe someone had been squatting nearby and saw the cabin as an easy target. Maybe it was just a local messing around. But the way they watched, the way they moved at night, and the way they tried to open the door, it wasn't random. It felt planned, meant to scare, meant to see what I would do. I haven't gone on another solo trip since. I still like being out in nature, but I always go with someone now. And I never stay anywhere that far off the grid. Not after that. I keep thinking how easily it could have gone worse. If I had gone outside. If I had confronted whoever it was. If I hadn't heard them in time. I still don't know what they wanted, but I'm glad I left when I did. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps on my porch, but they're never there. At least not yet. It started when I finally decided to take a break from everything. After working nearly every day for almost a year straight, long shifts, hardly any days off, bad sleep, fast food, stress building up without release, I finally snapped one morning. I walked into the office, looked at the screen full of emails, then stood back up, walked into my manager's office and requested a week off. He didn't argue. Maybe he saw it in my face. I was tired in a way that didn't show up on the outside. It was deep down in my chest, behind my eyes, like I'd been carrying bricks inside me for months. I didn't have any big plan. I just knew I didn't want to be near anyone. I searched for cabin rentals far away from the city. I wasn't trying to go to some trendy place with hot tubs and mountain views on Instagram. I just wanted peace, solitude, no traffic, no neighbors. I found a listing that seemed almost too plain to be real. It was a small, old cabin in northern Minnesota, at the edge of a place called Echo Ridge Forest. No pictures inside. One photo showed a single dirt road, trees everywhere, and the corner of the roof. The price was cheap. I booked it instantly. I drove 6 hours through smaller and smaller towns. By the time I was nearing the forest, my cell signal had dropped to 0 bars. The last 30 miles were on cracked back roads, then loose gravel and finally dirt. There were no signs. The air got colder the deeper I went. It was fall, late October. Orange leaves covered the road. I had the windows cracked and could smell the mix of pine, earth, and that dry scent that only comes with falling leaves. When I pulled up to the cabin, it was almost too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my tires on the leaves. The cabin looked old but sturdy, with siding, a small stone chimney, and a front porch with a broken rocking chair. No lights on, no welcome sign, just a key under a rock like the owner had said. I unlocked the door and stepped into stale air. It smelled faintly like dry wood, dust, and old cooking oil. Inside, the cabin had 2 rooms. One was the main living area with a small wood stove, a table, a couch, and a kitchenette with some cabinets and a sink. No fridge. The back room had a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out into the woods. There was no TV, no radio, no Wi-Fi. The only electricity came from a single bulb in each room, running off a small generator out back that the owner said only needed to be run an hour or 2 a day. I unpacked, made a simple dinner with some stuff I brought, canned soup and crackers, then sat outside until it got dark. That first night, I slept like a rock. I didn't dream. I didn't toss. I woke up the next morning feeling better than I had in months. The next couple of days were peaceful. I hiked, I read, I sat by the fire pit out back and listened to the wind through the trees. But on the fourth day, things started to feel different. Started small. I noticed boot prints by the fire pit that didn't match mine. I'd been wearing sneakers the whole time. These were larger and had a different tread pattern. I looked around and didn't see anything out of place. I figured maybe a hunter had wandered through. There weren't any posted signs. Still, I started locking the door when I left the cabin, and at night I pulled the curtains closed. The next morning, I woke up to find the cabin's door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I checked the windows, nothing broken. I walked the perimeter, but I didn't see anyone or anything. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I kept the axe near the door, just in case. I told myself not to be paranoid. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone for too long. But that night, I woke up to a sound. A soft thump. Not like a branch falling or an animal in the bushes. This was heavy, like a boot on a wooden floor. I held my breath. It was silent again. Then I heard it, another thump. Closer. I got up and grabbed the axe. I pressed my ear to the bedroom door. Nothing. I slowly opened it and stepped into the living room. It was empty. The front door was still closed. I checked the lock. Still turned. But something was off. The curtain by the front window had been pulled aside. I hadn't done that. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with the axe in my lap until the first light of morning came through the trees. I made coffee and didn't go outside until full daylight. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything out of place. About 30 yards into the woods, I found something. It was a crude wooden figure hanging from a tree, twigs tied together with string into the shape of a person. No face, no detail, just a stick figure. It swung lightly in the breeze. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt old, like something made out of habit, not humor. I took it down and brought it back with me, then burned it in the fire pit. That night, I blocked the front door with a chair. I kept the axe by the bed. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. At around 3:30 a.m., I heard the generator kick on. It had a manual pull start. No one could turn it on by accident. I looked out the back window and saw it running, humming quietly. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, watching, waiting to see if anyone stepped into view. No one did. I didn't go out to shut it off. At sunrise, I packed everything up and loaded the car. I locked the cabin and left the key under the rock, but I didn't leave right away. I had this gut feeling I couldn't ignore. I walked back into the woods, past where the twig figure had been. I kept walking for another 20 minutes. That's when I found something I can't explain. It was a small clearing, probably the size of a 2-car garage. In the center was a pit. Not a natural one, it had clean, sharp edges about 6 feet wide. Inside it, I saw bones. Animal bones, maybe, but they weren't buried. They were arranged. Circles, lines, patterns, all made of small, white bones. I stood there frozen for a long time. The forest around me felt like it was holding its breath. No wind, no birds, no sound. I didn't step any closer. I turned and walked back to the cabin, got in my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove in silence, watching the rearview mirror every few minutes. When I finally got home, I took a long shower and slept for nearly 12 hours. I tried to forget about the cabin. I didn't leave a review. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't tell anyone. But something had changed in me. I started keeping my doors locked at all times. I put up a camera outside my apartment. I started waking up at odd hours of the night, expecting to hear a boot step on my floor. A month later, I went to check the rental listing. It was gone. Not just unavailable, completely deleted. No name, no history, like it had never existed. I even tried checking satellite maps to find the road I drove down. Couldn't. I thought maybe I'd written the name down wrong, but I still had the confirmation email. I double-checked it. Same spot, but when I looked up Echo Ridge Forest on any map, there was nothing. Just a blank green patch with no trails, no roads, no buildings. I saved the email just in case. I even took a screenshot of it. Not because I planned to report anything, but because I needed proof. For myself. Proof that it had happened. That I had really gone there. That I hadn't imagined it. That was 6 months ago. I haven't taken another vacation. I'm back to working the same hours. Same routine. I tell myself I'll take another break soon. Go somewhere sunny. Crowded. Somewhere with people and noise and cell signal. But I haven't done it. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up and listen. Not for traffic or voices. I listen for that soft thump. That sound of a boot step on wood. I haven't heard it again. But sometimes I dream that I do. And in those dreams, I'm back in that forest, standing by the pit, watching the bones shift slowly into new shapes. But in real life, I stay away from cabins. I stay away from silence. And I never forget to lock my door. It was late October when I decided to take a short break from everything and head out to a remote cabin I had rented in the northern part of Minnesota. The cabin sat about 2 miles from the nearest dirt road, buried in thick woods that wrapped around a small, still lake. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps, and that was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. I had been feeling worn down after working long hours for months. I didn't want to talk to anyone or think about anything other than chopping wood and watching the lake. The drive out took most of the day. I passed smaller and smaller towns, until eventually I was driving down a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped the side of the vehicle as I crept along, watching the tree line for the small turnoff I had marked on a printed map. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. When I finally reached the spot, it was almost sunset. The cabin looked older than it did in the pictures, but it was solid. A single-story rectangle with a pitched roof, a short front porch, and a stone chimney. The lake lay still about 100 yards beyond it, surrounded by trees with fire-colored leaves. Inside, it was simple but cozy. A small wood stove in the corner, a cot-style bed, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and some shelves with basic supplies. No electricity. Just a couple of propane lanterns and a battery-powered radio. I unpacked my things, set some firewood by the stove, and made a simple dinner of canned chili. That night, I sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in a thick jacket, watching the moon ripple over the surface of the lake. The first couple of days passed peacefully. I woke early, chopped wood, walked along the lake, fished a little. I cooked simple meals, read paperbacks I brought with me, and sat quietly listening to the wind in the trees. At night, the woods were pitch black, the kind of black where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The silence was so complete it felt thick. But I didn't mind. I liked it, actually. It was what I had come for. On the 4th night, I started to feel a little off. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle sense of unease. Like I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in the woods. A trick of the mind. I ignored it and went about my routine. But the next day, I noticed something strange. I had a habit of stacking the firewood neatly against the back of the cabin. Every piece had its place. But when I came around the side after lunch, I noticed that one of the stacks had toppled over. Not all of it, just a section. It looked like it had been knocked over deliberately. There were no tracks in the dirt, no sign of animals. I rebuilt the stack and forgot about it. That night, I woke up in the dark. The cabin was cold, and I realized the fire in the stove had gone out. I got up to relight it, but as I moved around, I noticed that the lantern I had left on the table was missing. I looked everywhere, thinking maybe I had moved it and forgotten. I eventually found it outside on the porch, still lit, sitting upright next to the door. I stood there in the dark, the cold biting into my legs, trying to make sense of it. I had been alone. I was sure of it. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, nothing broken. I brought the lantern back inside, locked the door, and sat up the rest of the night, listening. Over the next 2 days, little things kept happening. The front door was left slightly ajar one morning. I always checked it before bed. A pair of socks I had hung to dry were missing from the porch railing. One of the fish I had caught and left in a bucket overnight was gone. the other floating belly up. I searched the woods for tracks, signs of animals or people, but found nothing. I started carrying my axe everywhere, even inside the cabin. I didn't sleep much. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me sit up, my eyes straining in the dark. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I had just misplaced things. Maybe I was so tired I wasn't thinking straight. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. It was the 7th night. I hadn't slept well for 2 nights in a row. I kept the fire going and sat at the table, watching the dark window across from me. I kept the axe beside me. Just past midnight, I heard movement outside. Not just the wind or a branch. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves. I turned off the lantern and waited. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything through the window. It was too dark. I didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Slowly, like someone was testing it. My chest tightened. I got up slowly and moved to the door, placing my hand on the cold wood. The rattling stopped. Then silence. I waited a long time, maybe 20 minutes. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving away. I stayed up the entire night. The next morning, I packed up some food and hiked 2 miles back to my truck. I drove into the nearest town, bought a trail camera from a small hunting store, and returned to the cabin before noon. I set the camera on a tree facing the cabin, aimed directly at the porch. That night, I slept with the axe in my hand. I kept the fire low, left the lantern off, and waited. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the steps again. This time they came from the back of the cabin. I didn't move. The fire cracked. I could hear something brush against the wood outside. Then silence again. The next morning, I ran out and grabbed the camera. I took it inside and scrolled through the images. Most were just shots of the cabin at different hours. But around 3:10 a.m., there was one clear image. A man standing just on the edge of the porch, facing the door. He was wearing a thick jacket and a cap pulled low. His face was turned slightly away. I couldn't make out any details, but he was close, just standing there. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I packed everything up. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I loaded the truck and drove until I reached a main road, then kept going until I was back in town. I checked into a cheap motel and stayed there overnight. The next day, I went to the sheriff's office. I showed them the image. They didn't recognize the man. They said it might have been a poacher or someone camping illegally, but they didn't seem too concerned. I gave them the location of the cabin and told them everything. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I haven't gone back since. I canceled the last few days of the rental and left the key in a Dropbox. That cabin is probably still sitting there, rotting quietly by the lake. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see, but I never do. I don't believe in ghosts. Nothing about what happened felt supernatural. It was worse than that. It was real. A real person had been out there with me in the woods watching, moving my things, testing the door, just standing there. The worst part is not knowing why. Not knowing what he wanted or how long he had been out there. Could have started that very first night. I think about that sometimes. How long he might have been watching me. I think that's the scariest part. I moved apartments a few months later. I still hike and camp, but I don't go alone anymore. I don't go anywhere I can't get back from quickly. I don't stay where there's no service. And I never, ever leave the door unlocked. It was early October when I drove up alone to a small cabin I had rented for a week in the middle of the woods in northern Michigan. I had found it listed on a site that focused on off-grid and secluded vacation spots. It looked rough but peaceful in the photos. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, no neighbors for miles. Just a wood stove for heat, a spring for water, and a thick forest all around. That was exactly what I needed. I'd been dealing with burnout, and I wanted silence and distance from people, from everything. The drive took me 6 hours from home. The last stretch of road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to something barely passable by car. By the time I got to the clearing where the cabin sat, My arms were sore from gripping the wheel through deep ruts and avoiding fallen limbs. It was almost evening, and the light was starting to slip behind the trees. The cabin was about the size of a garage. It had a small front porch, a metal chimney sticking out the roof, and one tiny window. There was a woodshed off to the side and a fire pit that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and mice. The floor creaked with every step. There was a narrow cot, a small table with a chair, and a counter with a hand pump for the spring water. I checked for any signs of animals or damage and didn't find anything too bad. Just some spider webs and a few mouse droppings. The stove looked solid, and there was enough wood stacked to last a week, maybe more. I unpacked my gear, lit a few candles I'd brought, and sat on the porch with a can of chili for dinner. The air was cool, crisp, and perfectly quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't see another person that day, or the next. I spent my time reading, chopping wood, walking trails that led nowhere, and just sitting for hours. That was what I came for. By day 3, I stopped checking my phone. There was no signal anyway. I settled into a rhythm. The weather held steady, cool, overcast, and dry. At night, I could hear owls and sometimes what I assumed were deer moving through the woods. I wasn't afraid. I'd grown up in the country. I camped alone plenty of times. It was peaceful. Then, on the 4th night, something changed. I was lying on the cot, half asleep, when I heard a thump outside. Not an animal kind of noise, more like a footstep on the porch. I froze and listened. Came again. Not fast, just one step. I sat up slowly, the blanket tangled around me, and waited. Then nothing. Silence. I must have sat there for 20 minutes without hearing it again. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a falling branch. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I found muddy prints on the porch. Human prints. Barefoot. Too long to be mine. I stared at them for a while. They came up the steps and stopped in front of the door. Then they turned and went back down. No sign of them anywhere else. I felt a knot in my stomach. I scanned the woods, but everything looked normal. Quiet. Still. I went back inside and locked the door, even though it wouldn't do much good if someone really wanted in. I tried to shake it off. People hike through these areas sometimes, right? Maybe someone had gotten lost or was messing around. But barefoot? Out here? It didn't sit right. That whole day, I kept looking over my shoulder. Couldn't relax. I kept thinking I was being watched. I chopped more wood than I needed just to stay busy. When night came, I didn't sleep. I kept the stove going and sat up with a flashlight and a heavy piece of firewood next to me. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was from the side of the cabin. A low scraping sound, then a soft knock. Not at the door, but the wall, like someone dragging their hand or a stick across it. Then another knock. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, and held my breath. I couldn't see anything through the tiny window. It was too dark. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet I'd brought for splitting wood. I held it tight and waited. Eventually, the noise stopped. No footsteps this time, just silence. When the sun came up, I walked around the cabin. No new prints, nothing disturbed. I started to wonder if I was imagining it. Maybe the wind, maybe a tree limb, but I didn't believe it. I was too on edge. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving back down that trail in the dark if something happened made me stay. I told myself I'd wait one more day, just to see. That day was tense. I kept scanning the woods. I barely ate. I didn't go for a walk. I just sat inside or on the porch with my hatchet. I started thinking about who would even come out here. There were no signs of other campers, no cars, no trash, nothing. Just dense woods. No reason for someone to be here. Not barefoot. Not in the middle of the night. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up with the stove lit, watching the shadows on the walls. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time it was at the back of the cabin. Something tapping on the wall. Then something bumped the window. A dull thud, like a fist. I stood up, heart racing, and stepped quietly to the window. I couldn't see anything. I turned off the flashlight and stared into the dark. Nothing. Then I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. A voice, not words, just a low hum, like someone humming a tune. It came from behind the cabin and moved slowly to the side. It was quiet, too quiet for me to recognize any kind of melody. Just a low, steady hum. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the dark. The humming faded into the distance. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When it did, I packed everything I could in 15 minutes. I didn't care about the food I left or the gear. I just wanted out. I locked the door out of habit and jogged to my car. As I drove out, I checked the mirrors constantly. The trail felt longer this time. Every turn, every shadow made me jump. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Didn't stop until I hit a gas station an hour away. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. I didn't know what to say. There were no faces, no violence, no crime. Just someone who came around a cabin in the woods. I never found out who it was. Never went back. I filed a report with the rental site and told them someone might be squatting in the area. I don't know if they ever followed up. I think the part that still sticks with me the most isn't the footprints or the knocking. It's the humming. That soft, steady hum moving past the cabin in the dark. It didn't sound angry or rushed. It sounded calm, like whoever it was had done it before, like they'd do it again. I still go camping. I still spend time alone in the woods, but I don't stay in cabins like that anymore. I stay where there are people nearby, roads, lights. I still love the quiet, but I don't trust it like I used to. That week changed something in me. I learned that the scariest things don't need to be loud or violent or even seen. Sometimes it's just a sound in the dark, a soft hum, a feeling that you're not alone. And the worst part is never knowing why, or what they wanted, or if they'll ever come back. I rented the cabin to get away for a while. I'd been living in the city too long. Noise all the time, sirens at night, people everywhere. I hadn't really slept well in months. Between work stress and personal stuff piling up, I just felt worn out. A guy I knew from college posted a listing online about a remote cabin in northern Minnesota that he wasn't using anymore. Said it had no internet, no TV, no neighbors, and that it sat right on the edge of a huge forest. It sounded perfect. I packed my car with supplies, canned food, bottled water, extra clothes, firewood, and a small generator. I brought a radio and a box of books too. Took me almost 10 hours to get there. The farther I drove, the fewer houses I saw. The last hour was all gravel roads and woods, the kind of place where GPS stops working. I had to rely on handwritten directions. The cabin was small and made of dark wood. It had one bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a sitting area. There was a wood stove and some old furniture, but it was clean. There was a well pump for water and a composting toilet out back. The front porch looked out over a lake that was still half frozen. The air was cold and clean, and everything was quiet. I felt like I could finally breathe. The first 2 days were peaceful. I chopped wood, read books, went for walks along the lake. I slept better than I had in a long time. My phone stayed off the whole time. I kept a journal and wrote about how I wanted to simplify things when I got back home. I even thought about moving permanently to a quieter place like this. On the third night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. I wasn't sure why. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had a strange feeling, like something wasn't right. I got up, put on my jacket, and stepped outside. It was cold and there was frost on the ground. I stood on the porch and looked around. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals, just stillness. I was about to go back in when I noticed something near the tree line. It looked like a tree stump at first, but it was too tall and narrow. I squinted and saw it shift slightly. It was a person. They were standing still, not moving, just facing the cabin. My stomach dropped. I watched for a full minute. The figure didn't move at all. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept getting up to look through the window. I didn't see the figure again. In the morning, I went out and looked at the spot where it had been. There were no footprints. The frost was untouched. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a shadow. but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I kept the lights on. I sat by the wood stove and read, but I kept glancing at the windows. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft crunch like someone stepping on frost. I turned off the lights and moved to the window. I waited, then I saw it again. The figure. This time it was closer, halfway between the treeline and the cabin. Just standing there. Couldn't see a face. No flashlight, no movement. Just standing. I stayed at the window until dawn. The figure never moved. When the sky started to lighten, it was gone. I went out and looked again. No prints. No sign that anyone had been there. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the axe with me. I didn't feel safe anymore. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to drive those narrow roads in the dark. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in a chair with the axe across my lap. I turned off all the lights, just the fire burning low in the stove. Around 1 in the morning, the generator shut off. I'd filled it earlier, so it shouldn't have run out. I went outside with a flashlight. The fuel line had been cut. I ran back inside and locked the door. I looked out the window and saw nothing, but I knew someone had done that. Someone was out there. I didn't sleep at all, just waited for morning. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my stuff. I got in the car and left. I didn't stop driving until I was 2 hours away. When I got home, I called the guy who owned the cabin. I told him someone was out there. He was quiet for a while, then said other people had mentioned similar things. Said it always started the same, seeing someone near the trees. Some even thought it was just a local messing with people, but no one had ever caught anyone. I didn't press him for more. I didn't want to know. I was just glad to be home. I sleep okay now, but I still wake up sometimes around 2 in the morning. I don't know why. I keep the curtains shut. I don't go camping anymore. I sold all my gear. I still think about going back to get answers, but I know I never will. Some places just aren't meant to be visited alone. And some silences aren't empty. They're waiting. It was early September when I decided to take a break from everything. I had just wrapped up a long summer of working construction jobs around the city, and I was completely worn out. My back hurt, my hands were blistered, and I felt like I hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks. I needed space. No texts, no emails, no traffic. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, far from people and the constant buzz of the world. I started looking for a place to rent out in the woods. Somewhere deep, isolated, and cheap. After a few hours online, I found a small off-grid cabin listed by an older guy who lived about 40 minutes outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The listing said it was a basic one-room setup with no electricity and only a small wood stove for heat. It had a hand pump for water, a tiny outhouse, and a single bed with a mattress that he claimed was clean and firm. The photos were a little blurry, but the place looked like what I wanted. Simple, surrounded by trees, and far from any neighbors. I packed up some gear. A couple coolers, dry food, sleeping bag, flashlight, lantern, a few books, and my knife. I drove out 2 days later. The drive to the property was long and winding. Once I got past Asheville, I turned onto smaller and smaller roads until I was climbing gravel switchbacks in complete silence. No cell service, no road signs, just thick trees pressing in from both sides. The directions the owner gave me were scrawled on a notepad, with landmarks like, turn left at the rusted mailbox, and when the pavement ends, drive 1.3 miles on dirt road. Felt like I was heading into the middle of nowhere. When I finally found the place, the sun was just starting to dip behind the hills. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The wood was gray and weather-worn, and the front porch had a crooked step. There was a stack of firewood leaning against the left side of the cabin, and the outhouse was about 50 feet behind it, past some brush. The only sign of recent use was a pile of empty beer cans near the fire pit and a few deep tire ruts in the dirt. Inside, the place was dead quiet. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some old canned food, and a wood stove in the corner. The bed was pushed up against the far wall. A single window let in a little light, but most of the place was dim and cool. I dropped my bags, unpacked my sleeping bag, and lit the lantern. Then I sat down at the table and just listened to the silence. The first night was peaceful. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and dry leaves drifted in through the cracks in the wood walls. I made a small fire outside, ate a sandwich, and went to bed early. I remember hearing some rustling in the woods as I lay there, but it didn't bother me. Probably deer or raccoons. I slept hard. The second day, I went for a short hike down one of the trails that started behind the outhouse. It wasn't marked, but the ground was worn enough that I could follow it easily. It wound down a slope, through a patch of dense rhododendron, and opened up near a rocky stream. I sat by the water for a while, listening to it bubble and splash. It felt good being away from everything. No pressure, no one to answer to, just trees and sky. That afternoon, though, I found something strange. I was walking back to the cabin when I noticed a patch of disturbed dirt off the side of the trail. At first, I thought it was where an animal had dug for grubs or something. But when I looked closer, I saw it was in a very clean rectangle, like someone had scraped away the leaves in a perfect shape, maybe 4 feet by 2 feet. There were no footprints, but something about it felt off. Too neat. I stood there a long time, staring at it, but eventually shrugged and walked on. Back at the cabin, I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe someone had camped there and cleared a spot for a tarp. That night, I cooked some beans over the fire, watched the stars, and read by lantern light. I turned in early again, and that night I didn't sleep quite as well. There were more noises, branches snapping, something brushing against the outside of the cabin wall. It wasn't loud, but I noticed it. Every time I started to drift off, a noise would wake me up again. The third morning, I woke up to find a deep scratch on the outside of the cabin door. Just one long mark, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp rock across it. I looked around the clearing, but I didn't see anyone or anything. No tire marks, no footprints. The scratch wasn't there the day before, I was sure of that. My first thought was maybe a bear, but it didn't look like a claw mark. It was too clean, too straight. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood and keeping an eye out. I had a weird, tight feeling in my chest most of the day. Not fear exactly, just tension, like I was waiting for something to happen. That night, I built up the fire and sat outside longer than usual, trying to calm my nerves. It got cold fast. I went inside around 10 p.m., locked the door with the rusty bolt, and lay in bed with my flashlight close. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, slow ones, crunching in the dry leaves. They came from behind the cabin, near the outhouse, and moved slowly toward the front. My heart started pounding. I turned off the lantern and sat up in the dark, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, slow and steady. Then they stopped. I waited. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, frozen in place, breathing shallow. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because I woke up just as the sun was coming up. I jumped out of bed, opened the door, and stepped out, scanning the clearing. No one was there, but near the edge of the woods, where the trail started, I saw something hanging from a branch. It was a dead squirrel strung up by its tail. Flies buzzed around it. The fur was matted and the body was stiff. That's when I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear in less than an hour, throwing stuff into my bags without organizing it. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I loaded the last bag into my car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw the second scratch, this one on the side of the cabin, deeper than the first. It hadn't been there the day before. I drove out fast, the gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and even then I kept going until I reached Asheville. I got a motel room that night, turned on the TV, and left every light in the room on. I didn't sleep much, but at least I wasn't alone in the woods. I never reported it to the guy who rented me the cabin. I figured he probably knew something was off with that place anyway. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. It wasn't the kind of story you can explain easily. Nothing really happened, but it felt like something was about to. And sometimes that's worse. Weeks later, back home, I did some online searching just out of curiosity. I tried to find any reports of weird things happening in that area. I didn't find much, just a few old forums with people talking about how the woods out there had a strange feeling, especially at night. One post mentioned finding dead animals in weird spots, but it was years old and had no replies. I still go camping, but I'm a lot more careful about where. I stick to places with people nearby, marked trails, and phone service. That week in the cabin changed something in me. I realized that not all danger announces itself with noise or movement. Sometimes it just watches, waits, circles your cabin in the dark, and leaves quiet marks behind.